commence to read the orders of the day.
Trade Bill, not amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
We will start with Government New Clause 5, with which it will be convenient to consider all the selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I now call the Minister to move New Clause 5.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to open the report stage of the Trade Bill and to move New Clause 5. This is all legislation that contains key measures that will deliver for UK businesses and consumers across the country, providing continuity and certainty. Amendments have been tabled by the Government and from across the House on the bill, and with the permission of the House, I will outline the Government's position on these more than 50 different amendments and on other amendments tabled before we hear from Honourable and Right Honourable members. Mr Deputy Speaker, turning first to Government New Clauses 5 and 6, together with Amendments 6, 7 and 9, the Government has been consistently clear that the priority for the UK's existing trade relationships as we leave the EU is continuity. Our partner countries are clear on that too, and this bill is about continuity. But it's about more than simply transitioning agreements. It's about ensuring that businesses, UK and partner country businesses, can continue to benefit from smooth operating borders once we become a wholly independent trading nation at the end of the transition period. The Government has set out our ambition to have a world-leading border by 2050. This will support our aim to make the UK a globally attractive place to do business as we move forward. To achieve that ambition, the Government needs to make better use of the data we currently hold, and New Clauses 5 and 6 are aimed at doing just that, unlocking the full potential of the data without placing any additional burden on businesses will not only allow us to achieve our vision for the future, but it will also benefit those businesses and consumers who depend on a frictionless border to ensure continuity of our trading relationships today. The smooth flow of traffic, goods and trade after the end of the transition period and during the introduction of import controls will support the manufacturing sector, especially those using the just-in-time methodology and individuals who enjoy using the online sector. New Clause 5 creates a new legal gateway so that government data can be used to A. Ensure continuity of trade by safeguarding existing trading relationships in both the EU and the rest of the world countries, so they are not frustrated by friction at the border for goods and services at the end of the transition period. B. To provide better services to UK businesses and consumers by supporting the effective management of the end-to-end border process, and C. To underpin the delivery of a world-leading border protecting the UK, protecting revenue and growing international trade. This is an amendment that external border industry stakeholders are very supportive of. Indeed, they have been calling for exactly this type of action for a long time. So I want to be clear to the House on a number of important issues around the amendment. First, this all relates to existing data. There are no new powers for data collection in these government amendments. Second, it is discretionary and specific. It does not create a data-sharing free-for-all between public authorities. The amendment is carefully drafted to limit the data that can be shared to only that related to trade functions. These are functions that in the main are the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Trade or the Minister for the Cabinet Office. If the information is not required for trade functions, it cannot be requested under the gateway. And before any data can be disclosed, the public authority making the disclosure must also be satisfied that they have complied with their own existing data protection obligations, most notably in relation to the Data Protection Act 2018 and GDPR. But government recognises that there may be concerns about what happened to the data once it has been passed to Cabinet Office or DIT or other departments. I want to assure all members of the House no data will be made available or sold to third parties outside government, a concern which I know a number of colleagues have raised in the past. Nor will it be used to monitor citizens or businesses or target individuals to be stopped at the border. These measures are, as I have said, about making sure that border flow is maintained and that traffic, goods and services are free to flow with as little friction as possible. Furthermore, New Clause 6 makes it an offence to disclose unlawfully any personal data shared under the amendment. The Government has also tabled Amendments 6, 7, 8 and 9, which make minor changes to existing Clause 8. These amendments are to enable HMRC data to be shared with all Ministers of the Crown, where HMRC are satisfied that the data may be shared for the Minister's functions relating to trade. The current drafting enables HMRC to share data with the Secretary of State for the same purpose. The practical effect of this amendment is to enable HMRC to share data with the Cabinet Office, which is not headed by a Secretary of State. Mr. Deputy Speaker, turning to new clauses 1, 2 and 3, which seek to replicate the effects of government amendments brought forward to the 2017 to 2019 Trade Bill. Over the course of this legislation and its 2017 to 2019 version, I have had constructive discussions with my honourable friend, the member for Huntingdon, regarding the purpose of the government's continuity programme. And I would like to thank him for the interactions he's had with me, particularly around the important issue of transparency. His efforts have directly changed the bill through inserting the use of the affirmative procedure when exercising the power in Clause 2 and ensuring that Parliament has transparency in relation to continuity agreements through the laying of parliamentary reports alongside signed agreements setting out significant changes with the underlying EU agreement. As members from across the House know, the purpose of our continuity programme is to provide certainty to businesses and consumers by retaining the preferential trading arrangements the UK benefits from as signatory to trade agreements the EU had signed with third countries before exit day. And that is why, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have now concluded 20 continuity agreements with 48 countries, accounting for £110 billion worth of UK trade in 2018, which represents 74% of the trade with countries with whom we are seeking continuity before the withdrawal agreement was signed. And each of these agreements have been accompanied by a parliamentary report. I can confirm we will continue to publish reports for all continuity agreements yet to be signed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as these parliamentary reports make clear, our continuity programme has remained true to its mandate, replicating our existing trade relationships. Let me repeat, the standards have not been lowered in these 20 agreements. Unsafe food will not be entering our market, and our right to choose how we deliver public services has been protected. Mr. Deputy Speaker, new Clause 3 would stipulate that the parliamentary reports must be published at least 10 days, sitting days, before any SIs are made under this power. As I explained to colleagues in the Public Bill Committee a few weeks ago, trade negotiations, as I think we all know, have a habit of going down to the wire. I only have to remind colleagues of the negotiations surrounding the EU withdrawal agreement as evidence of this fact, although I might point out, Mr. Deputy Speaker, before I get people too excited, that that particular negotiation is not included in the scope of this bill. As such, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is possible we may not be able to sign continuity agreements until shortly before the transition period ends. This may make it very difficult to leave a period of 10 sitting days before any SIs are brought forward if we want continuity agreements to enter into force on day one after the transition period. Of course, I'll give way.
And for his earlier comments. But when we talk about these continuity agreements, are they still continuity agreements? If we look at Japan, for instance, it looks like it's going to be a very different agreement that the EU had. Canada, for instance, is saying that it's not going to have the same agreement. It wants to see what we get with the EU first. Why does he still call them continuity agreements? Is this clause not looking at a position that we had 2 years ago? Should we not now move on?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and let me be clear, we are talking about continuity, and judge us not necessarily by just what I say, but look at our actions. When you look at the 20 reports that we have so far published, 5 of those have been called for debate in the other place. Not a single one of those debates resulted in a motion of regret. He is right, though, about one thing. He is right about one thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and that is on Japan. I will come on to examine Japan shortly, but Japan is different. We have been clear that that will lead to an enhanced free trade agreement based on the original EU agreement, and that is why we have put in place different and more considerable scrutiny arrangements for the Japan agreement than for the rest of the continuity programme. So as we do, to avoid a cliff edge for both businesses and consumers, I would remind colleagues that all continuity agreements will be subject to the CRAG, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, ratification procedure. This already provides for a period of 21 sitting days in which agreements and the parliamentary reports and explanatory memoranda, which are published alongside, can be scrutinised by parliamentarians before they are formally ratified. Mr. Speaker, I now address Amendments 1 to 5 in the name of my honourable friend, the member of Huntingdon, as well as Amendments 22 and 26. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman, the member of Brent North, and it is great to see him back in trade.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. But he talks of CRAG as if it is a process under which this Parliament actually has any power. He knows that it's the government that enables Parliament to have a debate whereby it could actually vote against what is tabled under the CRAG process. And therefore, he really must look again at the way in which real scrutiny can be brought to bear and real accountability can be brought to bear in the way that his honourable friend is suggesting.
Well, I thank him for that intervention, and it is good to see him back, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I remember he was originally a Blairite minister in Tony Blair's government, and it's been really, really instructive to see the journey that the member for Brent North has been on over some time, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I saw him take the seat in the extreme corner of the chamber earlier, and I thought not only has he taken on the member for Islington North's views, but he's now even taken his previous seat, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So what I would say to him is that he voted for CRAG in 2010. I voted for CRAG in 2010. Well, we both voted for CRAG in 2010. CRAG allows Parliament to block a trade deal, allows Parliament to block international treaties. That was the intention when his government designed it in that way, to allow Parliament the ability to block an international agreement. And that remains the case today. I'm going to make a little bit more progress, Mr. Deputy Speaker. No, I'm going to make a little more progress. So, as I said, the other place have held debate on 6 of the agreements, not one carried a motion of regret. We've also retained the use of the affirmative resolution procedure for regulations required to implement single agreements. The Government recognises that there may be concern that the Clause 2 power could be used to implement completely new agreements with continuity countries now and in the future, with inadequate opportunities for parliamentary scrutiny. We've heard suggestion at committee that some of the upcoming continuity agreements, such as Canada and Singapore, will go beyond continuity, which I think was a point made by my honourable friend, and therefore require a more comprehensive scrutiny process. Let me reassure honourable members that we view the underlying EU agreements as sufficient, and we are not seeking to enhance those deals or go beyond continuity. These will be technical changes to make the agreements function in a UK-specific context. However, the Government acknowledged that the UK-Japan agreement, while based on the existing agreement the EU has with Japan, will be an enhanced agreement. It is an exception to our continuity. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and with ceramics being the fourth largest exporter into Japan from their industry, does he not see an enhanced trade deal with Japan as an opportunity rather than the doomsayers from the opposition?
Thank my honourable friend, and he is absolutely right. In all of my interactions and the Secretary of State's interactions with the ceramics industry and with MPs representing key ceramics constituencies, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Japan deal is extremely important for this country. And I'm disappointed that the party opposite, in fact, the parties opposite, seem to have no enthusiasm for our continuity of our trade with Japan, Mr. Deputy Speaker, or its enhancement. So we have committed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I won't give way at this moment. We've committed to additional scrutiny arrangements for any deal with Japan. We believe that the current sunset provisions in the bill strike the right balance between flexibility for negotiators, the ability to keep agreements operable, and providing sufficient constraint and scrutiny to Parliament. The Government will be very aware that during the 2017-19 trade bill there was uncertainty and concerns from Parliament as to the nature of the Government's continuity programme. Indeed, I can testify, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because I was the Minister at the time, and that is why we have brought forward a number of amendments to that bill. However, there is a crucial change in the circumstance since the last bill. Parliament can now see that we have not strayed beyond our mandate to deliver continuity. The transition agreements have not resulted in new or enhanced trading obligations. Standards have not been reduced in any way, and our right to choose how we deliver public services has been protected. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to move on because time is short. There's a 50 amendment. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful for my old friend giving way. Just in this context, I understand why there's limited scrutiny for small trade deals. My friend has talked about enhanced scrutiny for the Japan deal, but he'll know that for many constituents, it is the US trade deal and the China trade deal that will raise most concerns. Can he give us some assurance that this progress of increasing scrutiny in Parliament will be higher for those specific deals than for the ones he's spoken about thus far?
Minister. I can absolutely give him that assurance, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm going to come on to discuss those, though they're not within the scope of the bill as it is written, in just a moment. But I can absolutely give him that assurance. So I would like to start by noting my honourable friend has tabled new Clause 4 on new trade agreements and giving me the opportunity to stress the importance the government places on parliamentary scrutiny and the commitments we have made in this space. The House will know that negotiation and entering into of international agreements is a prerogative power of the executive. This amendment would give Parliament veto rights over our negotiating objectives. To quote the Constitution Committee in the other place, who reported on this in 2019, quote, "This would impinge inappropriately on the government's prerogative power and limit the government's flexibility in negotiations." I agree. And as this House will know, there are already rigorous checks and balances on the government's power to negotiate and ratify new agreements through the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which the honourable lady from the front bench, she's fond of heckling, Mr Deputy Speaker, but she voted for the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act in 2010. I'm going to give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I concur entirely with what he's saying. Is it not the case that if we allow further parliamentary scrutiny, we won't get the best deal from these negotiations? And at present, this is the Westminster-style democracy with the greatest parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals.
My honourable friend, Mr Deputy Speaker, is absolutely correct. Our scrutiny offer compares very favourably with Australia's and New Zealand and is at least as equal to Canada. But could I point out, Mr Deputy Speaker, he's right in other regards as well. Some of the amendments today would obligate the government to publish text after the end of each negotiating round. At the moment, Mr Deputy Speaker, we publish a written ministerial statement. But to publish the text when this government, this country, is undergoing simultaneous negotiations with different partners, the idea that we publish the interim text with the United States so that Australia, New Zealand and Japan and all of our partners could see it. Mr Deputy Speaker, that is not a sensible way of proceeding. I'm going to make more progress. So this government understands the desire of Parliament to have effective scrutiny of our FTA programme. That is why we've gone above and beyond the baseline provided by CRAG and committing to publishing comprehensive information ahead of entering into negotiations with partner countries. We've already done this, Mr. Deputy. I'm going to make progress for the US, for Japan, Australia and for New Zealand. This has included publishing negotiating objectives and initial economic assessments. We have also committed to laying final impact assessments once negotiations have concluded, and we know the content of the proposed agreement in its entirety. I'm going to make some more progress. In addition, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government is committed to providing regular updates to Parliament on the progress of negotiations. We've already adopted a similar approach for Japan because it's an enhanced agreement, and the important distinction which the amendment does not make, requiring, as it does, those rollover agreements not yet signed to be subject to the same scrutiny as new agreements, even though the original EU third-party agreement has been subject to both EU and UK scrutiny. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to make more progress. For new trade agreements, the government has already committed to work closely with the relevant scrutiny committees in both houses throughout negotiations. This includes providing confidential briefings as appropriate to keep them apprised. And this approach is in line with the recommendations of the former member for Blackburn, Sir Jack Straw, who served in government with the honourable gentleman, the member for Brent North opposite. In his evidence, the Lord Constitution Committee said it would be for the negotiators to decide how much privacy and confidentiality there should be during negotiations, and certainly not for others. And finally, when negotiations have concluded, we will work with the relevant Select Committee to assure, where practical, there is time for the committee to produce a report on the final agreement before, I'm not going to give way in this section further, before it is laid in Parliament under CRAG. Similarly, if the committee were to recommend, important this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, were to recommend a debate on an agreement prior to ratification, the government, of course, would consider that request subject to parliamentary timetable. Taken together, this means that Parliament will have comprehensive information, including economic assessments, on our agreements, both prior to negotiations commencing, at key points during negotiations and at the conclusion of talks. And finally, on this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is extremely important. International agreements cannot themselves alter domestic law, and any changes to UK legislation would need to be scrutinised by Parliament in the normal way. We are strongly committed to transparency, as demonstrated by the steps we have taken to provide comprehensive information to the public in Parliament at the stop. Mr Deputy Speaker, I will put him out of his misery. I will give way to the honourable member, the right honourable member, the member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale. Yes.
The Minister is very, very generous. I would just want to make a point about scrutiny and the nature of it. The Trade and Agriculture Commission, which the government rightly, I think, came forward with a few weeks ago to add weight to the scrutiny of trade deals when it comes to animal welfare, environmental standards, labour standards in any trade deal. What can he do to give more assurance to farmers in particular that those deals will not lead to an undermining of their business and of their standards to, in many ways, put this on the face of the bill to ensure that they cannot be let down?
Well, I thank you for that intervention, and it allows me to say that actually the NFU have been incredibly welcoming of this proposal. Minette Batter said it is a hugely important development in ensuring UK's farming's high standards of animal welfare and animal protection are not undermined in future trade deals. Mr Deputy Speaker, three things crucially. We have a strong manifesto commitment to have no compromise on Britain's standards of animal welfare, food safety and the environment. Secondly, we are transposing the EU rules into UK law to take effect on the 1st of January. And the third is simply this, Mr Deputy Speaker. It would be for Parliament, if it wanted, to block any such changes. If anybody thought that they would introduce any of these controversial products, it would be for Parliament would be able to block that. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I say, the government is strongly, I'm going to make progress, is strongly committed to transparency, as demonstrated by the steps we have already taken. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I could move on. New Clause 12 proposes a review of free trade agreements every 5 years after entry into force. We've already established regular dialogue with the International Trade Committee, and that's perhaps the best forum to provide information and assessment of the UK's wider trade environment and trade relationships to Parliament. Turning now to New Clause 18, this amendment seeks to effectively give Parliament and the devolved legislators binding votes or vetoes over international agreements, which would be to fundamentally undermine the royal prerogative and, worse, limit our flexibility to negotiate the deals that would best serve the interests of UK businesses, consumers and communities. I give way to the honourable.
Thank you for giving way. And I accept the point he's making that for devolved parliaments to be able to undermine a national trade deal would be wrong. However, can he give us some guidance and some assurance that in the case of Northern Ireland, where we find ourselves in a position not with continuity deals but with new deals, that we could actually be excluded from some of the benefits of those deals? How will he make an assessment, and how will he enable the devolved administration to be able to have an input into decisions which are made in those deals if we find that we are disadvantaged by being excluded from them?
Well, I thank him for that intervention. First thing to say is that I have a regular dialogue with his colleague, the Northern Ireland Economy and Trade Minister. In fact, I'm meeting her tomorrow, in fact twice, to talk about these particular issues. What I can reiterate is that Northern Ireland remains part of the UK customs area, and Northern Ireland will benefit from UK free trade agreements. We have been absolutely categoric on both of those points. So, New Clause 18 seeks to give Parliament, as I say, a veto over those arrangements, and seek to and the government seek approval from the devolved legislators on the final agreement. As I say, I'm in regular contact with the devolved ministers for the devolved administrations on these issues. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll now turn to new clauses 7 to 9 and others in relation to standards. And I think in answer to the intervention from the member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, the Right Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, that we have already given cast-iron commitments during the debate on this bill and the agriculture bill that we will not be diluting standards in any area or in any way following the UK's departure from the EU. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I acknowledge the undertakings that the government have given to agriculture and food production. But can he also assure me that future UK trade policy will be fully aligned to our climate change and environmental policies? And in striking new trade deals, the government will at all times promote low-carbon industries like offshore wind, and will not undermine those UK businesses working hard to lower their own carbon footprints.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I absolutely give him those assurances. The government's climate change agenda, in fact the whole country's agenda, is incredibly important for us at the Department for International Trade. We put in a lot of time and effort in promoting our capability and capacity in things like offshore wind. I'm regularly saying to international investors and to trade partners the UK now has the largest offshore wind capacity in the world. This is something that we are seeking to export. This is something which trade agreements can be helpful in. We're working with some of our key partners on these aspects of trade agreements, but there can also be something that the whole of government can work together with. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to make more progress. So let me address matters related to animal welfare, food standards and food safety. I recognise the strength of feeling this issue generates amongst colleagues on all sides of the House. But as I, the Secretary of State, and my DEFRA colleagues have told this House on many occasions, this government will stand firm in trade negotiations. We will always do right by our farmers and aim to secure new opportunities for the industry, and will not dilute our high environmental protection, animal welfare and food safety standard. I'm going to take an intervention from behind you.
I don't think there isn't just concern, obviously, on every side of this House. He knows that there is a lot of concern out there among the public and our constituents, and we've heard commitments from the front bench. And when I was Food Safety Minister, I gave those commitments too around domestic food standards. Many, many people want it set out in black and white on the face of a bill. I suspect the Minister is going to go on to say why he will resist New Clause 7, for instance, this evening. So what assurance can he give me and my constituents and the many others that will be listening to this debate that that just isn't necessary because those standards are protected in law, not just in word?
I thank him for that intervention, and it allows me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to explain, I think, the difference between where some of these amendments are coming from, which seek to dynamically align other people's methods of production with those that we use in the UK. Yes, we will have and maintain exceptionally high standards of domestic production, domestic products, and also import controls. We can be of influence on our trading partners, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I cannot put into legislation a dynamic, a regulatory alignment playing field for our trading partners. That would be something that would be both impractical. It would also render inoperable most of our existing trading agreements and potentially render impossible doing a future trade agreement with the European Union. If all of these trading partners had to sign up to dynamically aligning their standards with the UK, that would make it extremely challenging, not just to keep our existing trade agreements, but to do trade agreements with the partners of the future. I'm not going to give way because I've gone on, Mr. Deputy Speaker, long enough, I think.
Do want to take part in this report stage, that those who have indicated and are on the call list, you should be thinking about 4 minutes. Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I've got much more to say, and it is in relation to 50 different amendments. But I appreciate there's a large number of other speakers. So I think I will call it a day there, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of my contribution, allow other people to say, but I think I've covered the main areas of outlining why we have the requirements in New Clause 5 and 6 on data, why we are confident of our robust approach to parliamentary scrutiny, using the CRAG process and enhance things that we have introduced to make sure that Parliament gets the information, has the say that it needs, and finally our absolute commitment to not compromising on standards in relation to food safety, animal welfare and the environment. I beg to move.
New Clause 5, disclosure of information by other authorities.
The question is that new clause 5 be read a second time. Bill Esterson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. International trade has rarely been more important. It's critical as we forge a new place in the world outside the European Union. It is also critical to how we recover from the pandemic, as it has the power to deliver prosperity at home and abroad, especially in the developing world as we aim towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We will support the government where it is right and challenge where it is wrong. There are 3 key areas to which our amendments to the trade bill refer: social, environmental and democratic. First, social. The bill has profound implications for workers' rights, human rights, public services and the economy. Second, environmental. As my right honourable friend, the member for Islington South, reminded us at second reading, international trade agreements have a massive impact on our ability to tackle the climate and environment emergency. Meanwhile, food production and animal welfare standards are matters of enormous concern to farmers and consumers alike. Third, democratic. The complete absence of scrutiny runs like the St Andreas fault through the bill. Yep. Thank you, San Andreas fault. Our amendments on that fault, I'll give way to him in a moment. Our amendments attempt to rectify serious shortcomings and the lack of accountability. We were promised a modern framework for international trade negotiations in the Queen's speech.
The Queen said it.
This bill was supposed to be the opportunity to deliver that framework. It does not. The bill gives ministers powers to make changes to retained EU law upstairs in a committee of 17 MPs after a maximum debate of 90 minutes. These powers are retained for up to 10 years. That's quite some grab by the executive. That's far from the whole story either. The final text of an agreement depends on the government granting debates to the opposition during a 21-day period, something that did not always happen in the last Parliament. It relies on the opposition using its limited opportunities to determine the agenda for such a debate. The government should be holding the debate and a vote in both houses as a matter of course. New Clause 4 is an opportunity to address some of the democratic deficit in the bill. Only half of the 40 agreements covered by the bill have been signed. We're told by the Minister they've already been scrutinised by the European Union. But these are not the simple matters of continuity the Minister would have us believe. Only 3 out of 20 existing mutual recognition agreements have been signed with Switzerland, our third largest non-EU trading partner. South Korea has only signed a temporary agreement and wants to start again. And a number of the remaining 20 are going to be completely new. Japan, new agreement. Turkey, our 10th largest non-EU trading partner, in a customs arrangement with the EU and waiting for the UK to sign a free trade agreement with the EU.
Yeah, he hasn't said anything about that.
Canada in no hurry to negotiate at all. As I said, far from simple matters of continuity, which is why they need proper scrutiny.
Would my honourable friend give way on that point? I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Does he share with me the sense that the government has told us that it needed this bill in order to be able to produce these rollover agreements? And yet the Minister stood at the dispatch box today and said that we have concluded 20 of these rollover agreements. In fact, they managed to do that without this bill having passed into law. So is it not absolutely relevant what he's saying, that it's these future agreements that we need legislation for, and it should be proper legislation that actually sets out the framework under which this Parliament scrutinises what is going on?
He's absolutely right, and I pay tribute to his time as the Shadow Secretary of State and the work he did on scrutinising and opposing this bill first time round. And he's absolutely right, too, to say that what we heard already from the Minister just bears out everything that we've been saying for the last 3 years. And as I say, these are not simple matters of continuity, which is why we need proper scrutiny. The problems don't end there. This bill will put in place the framework for a new generation of new agreements, including those with the United States, Australia, and the controversial so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. It's been very patient, so I'll give one.
Thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I wonder, as a member of the International Trade Select Committee, with cross-party membership, of course, why he cheapens that committee and says there's no scrutiny. And can I welcome the involvement from the government to date? But can I ask him directly, prior to the CRAG Protocol Act, how many trade deals does this place vote on while the power rested in Brussels?
Well, as he knows, being on the International Trade Committee, that CRAG was part of the process we had as EU members, and I'll come to that in more detail a bit later on. I will give way.
I'm grateful for giving way. I would just note that actually, as a member of the European Parliament's Trade Committee, I had far more powers of scrutiny over trade agreements as an MEP than I've ever had as an MP here. But my point was, would he agree with me, and does he share my concern, that the government's refusal to bar imports of producers that are produced to lower environmental or animal welfare standards spells real disaster for our farmers? Because if they're going to get undercut by cheaper produce that doesn't meet the same standards, how on earth can they make a living if they've got to get higher standards and therefore probably higher cost as well?
Well, she does anticipate some of the things I'm going to say a bit later on, and it's entirely consistent with what I said about environmental aspects of the bill. There is widespread recognition across society that parliamentary scrutiny is essential in international trade agreements. The honourable member for Huntingdon and his colleagues deserve the credit for their sterling efforts to build a consensus. Their new Clause 4 has many of the elements of good scrutiny practice which a modern, confident, outward-looking country would want to adopt. Scrutiny and a vote on the negotiating mandate, assessment against domestic standards, consultation with the devolved administrations, and a vote on the deal by both houses. These are a very good place to start, and we can also learn from good practice elsewhere. For example, a very different approach is taken in the United States. Their advisory committees have access to negotiating texts. Trade unions are represented as well as employers. Confidentiality agreements ensure that consultation is at an appropriate level. The result is that agreements can be amended, as with the recent USMCA, where strengthening of the labour chapter is intended to end union busting in Mexico. So how do we compare? Oh dear. So-called expert trade advisory groups, ETAGs, in this country are completely different. The government doesn't tell us what the criteria for membership is, or who the members are. Trade unions are excluded from a number of the groups which were not set up to scrutinise trade deals. Talk now of a room next door approach has raised concerns because of the overly restrictive nature of the NDAs. As drafted, they would prevent sensible consultation and analysis of the texts, even by the existing self-selecting and very limited memberships of the ETAGs.
Would he accept that we can learn through failure as well, and that one of the reasons that TTIP failed was because there was a lack of involvement of trade unions, industry and a number of different partners until right at the last minute when people were asked to vote on something which they hadn't been brought along with?
Well, she's absolutely right, and I shall come to TTIP as an example of how not to carry out scrutiny and of the reasons why it's so important to have that wider engagement. Now, I mentioned I'll give way a little later if he doesn't mind, because there's a lot of members waiting to speak. This talk of a room next door approach has raised concerns because of the overly restrictive nature of the NDAs. The chaotic way the government plans to create its room next door system sounds more like a sketch by Mr. Michael Spicer than how a responsible government might engage with scrutiny. I don't know if Michael Spicer is talking to the honourable member or not. We'll find out in a moment.
The Shadow Minister talks about scrutiny and refers to the trade unions. But if we have trade unions at the table, who is scrutinising the trade unions to make sure that they are not pushing their own agenda from their own sector upon a UK-wide deal? How do we include their impartiality if they are beholden to a militant number of members? Because as we know, in trade unions, not every member is politically motivated nor engaged.
Well, it's a shame he's taken up some time of honourable members in this debate which with such rubbish. The 2010 Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, CRAG, is the only formal parliamentary process in place for the agreements not covered by the bill, including with the United States. That's not scrutiny, is it?
I thank the honourable friend for giving way. Just to backtrack a moment and to remind him of the claims being made by the Minister in his opening remarks, when he was claiming that we would enjoy better scrutiny than countries such as Australia and New Zealand, which I think is disputable. But there was an exception or an omission, which was the United States. Should that not concern everyone?
Well, absolutely. We compare very badly with the scrutiny in the United States, some of which I've already described. My honourable friend's right to make the comparison. And isn't it ironic that we are in the middle of trade talks with the United States where they have full scrutiny and we don't? While we are stuck with CRAG, in the United States, debates and votes will take place in Congress, alongside the engagement with business and the unions which I described earlier. And let's remind ourselves that CRAG was introduced as part of our scrutiny process while we were EU members, because trade agreements were an EU competence. The process included full scrutiny in the European Parliament, scrutiny which has not been replaced by an equivalent system. The honourable lady from Brighton Kemptown Pavilion, sorry, I get it the right way, Pavilion, reminded us of her own experience performing exactly that role. The Minister wrote to MPs last week. I think he read out quite a lot of his letter in his speech. He told us last week, legislation will be debated and scrutinised by Parliament in the usual way. The usual way? There is no usual way, because the usual process only worked alongside the scrutiny carried out for us in the European Parliament. Despite what the Minister says, CRAG on its own makes no sense unless the government wishes to avoid scrutiny. Today's amendments are similar to those which were passed in March 2019. The Minister is fond of telling us how vital it is that this bill passes. So why didn't they accept the amended bill last year? It could have saved a lot of trouble.
A lot of time.
And time. What possible reason could the government have for wanting to avoid scrutiny? Why on such important areas? Maybe there are some clues in the topics covered by the various amendments. The threat to our NHS is right at the top of the list. ISDS was a scandal that came to prominence during the TTIP negotiations. And let's look at some examples of the threat posed by ISDS. The Portuguese government was sued using ISDS when the Lisbon Metro was returned to public ownership. ISDS clauses in bilateral investment treaties are being used now to prepare a series of cases against the UK government for pausing construction contracts during the pandemic. And it's not just ISDS. Standstill clauses prevent governments from returning privatised public services to the public sector. Ratchet clauses require further services to be privatised. And then there are negative lists which require governments to specify exactly which services are to be exempt from privatisation, with everything else up for grabs. The Prime Minister told us he favours a social insurance system in his Daily Telegraph article. So when ministers tell us not to worry about the NHS, it simply won't wash. Statements alone are worthless. It's very simple. The detailed texts of all agreements must include cast-iron commitments, because it's not just the Prime Minister who wants to hand over our NHS to the healthcare corporations, it's his friend the US President, and it's in the US negotiating objectives, which refer to full market access for US products. They want access to NHS medicines and more, and are not shy about saying so. Scrutiny matters, and nowhere more than in the protection of our NHS in international trade agreements. That's why our new Clause 17 is so important. Our ministers say that they want export opportunities for our farmers in the United States and Australia. Export opportunities? Really? Ministers are missing the point. Farmers have to survive first. If food imports are allowed with lower production, welfare standards and costs, farmers will struggle to stay in business. They'll be undercut. As Trade Representative Lighthizer warned us, on issues such as agriculture, this administration is not going to compromise. There's no ambiguity in Mr Lighthizer's commitment not to compromise, is there? The idea that farmers will make up for domestic sales by exporting more is a fantasy. The magical thinking of ministers will not stand up to scrutiny. That is, if scrutiny is ever allowed, of course. I'll give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I have to say that Northern Ireland producers in the agri-food sector export 75% of their product, so therefore it's really important for us to have more markets, and more markets will come across the world. Mass Direct, one of the major agri-food sectors in my constituency, actually are already exporting to the United States for their different vegetable and potato products. So there are markets there which can be a climate we can grab and take forward and get more jobs and more employment, and Northern Ireland will do better because of it.
I'm grateful to him for raising the point about Northern Ireland because, of course, when the bill was published, the government was sticking to the mantra there would be no border. And how these new arrangements will operate in Northern Ireland and the impact on the UK is exactly why there needs to be proper scrutiny of these agreements and their impacts. The Trade and Agriculture Commission is advisory, not regulatory. It has no teeth. It isn't representative. It doesn't report to Parliament. It cannot enforce import standards, and it will be gone again in 6 months' time anyway. It can't stop changes to food standards if the government agrees them in a trade deal with the US. Can it? Because it doesn't have any teeth. The member for Tiverton and Honiton said that he'd been led up the garden path by the government on the agriculture bill. The government should lead him and his colleagues back down again, accept his new Clause 4 and our new Clause 11 and guarantee them in primary legislation. Mega farms in the United States and Australia stand to benefit from any lowering of animal welfare and production standards. When we banned sow stalls in the UK, we had to admit pork from countries which hadn't caught up with our standards. What happened? Half our pig farmers went bust. If we were to accept chemical-washed chicken, our poultry industry would go bust too. It must not happen again. Public health, animal welfare and food production are inextricably connected. Hormones in animal feed may cause cancer in people. Industrial farming techniques affect the environment and global warming. In the middle of a global pandemic, minds should be concentrated. The use of antibiotics in farming is linked to the ability of diseases to jump between species. A coalition of businesses, unions, consumers, environmentalists and civil society is warning of a democratic deficit. The coalition is headed by the International Chambers of Commerce. They say, we no longer live in a world where trade can be treated separately from our international commitments on issues such as climate action, digitisation or building a more resilient health system. The public need to feel confident that trade decisions and processes are working for them, and the bill is a good opportunity to embed more transparent, consensus-based, democratic approach that clearly demonstrates a net benefit to all. I'm not going to take any more interventions. I'm about to finish. It's an opportunity to set a new gold standard. I said at the start, this trade bill is really about social responsibility, environmental protection and democracy. The lack of scrutiny threatens to leave the NHS wide open to pharmaceutical giants and to undermine farmers and consumers. Chemical washes of chicken, hormones in beef, ractopamine in pork and GM crops are banned in the UK. What's wrong with keeping it that way? If the government is saying that we're going to do it anyway, what's the objection to putting it all in primary legislation? The trouble is, we all know what's really going on here. They don't want to put protections for our NHS, farmers and consumers in law or take the action needed on the climate crisis because they have no intention of keeping their promises.
Just in case the House is not already aware, after the next speaker, we will have a time limit of 4 minutes on backbench speeches, which of course does not apply to Mr. Stuart Hosey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think there are 4 significant flaws with this piece of legislation. The absence of devolved consent, real protections for the NHS, the preservation of food standards and meaningful parliamentary scrutiny. I believe our Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 deal with the first 3, and the Honourable Gentleman from Huntingdon's new clause 4 deals with the final issue. I wish to move the Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 in my name, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll start slightly in reverse order with Amendment 10. It relates to the powers of the devolved administrations, or as I said in committee, more accurately, the ability of the UK Government to make regulations under subsection 1, which make provisions within devolved competencies without the consent of Scottish or Welsh ministers or a Northern Irish devolved authority granting consent. And it strikes me as fundamental that if we are to genuinely respect the devolved settlement in the UK, then ministers must self-evidently gain the consent of the devolved administrations before making changes to regulations which directly affect them, and possibly in a negative way or in a way which runs counter to those government's policy objectives. Now, I am aware in the previous trade bill under consideration between 17 and 19, there was a problematic provision for regulation-making powers to be available to the UK Government, but the good news is those provisions have been removed from this trade bill. But it is the case there remains no statutory obligation for the UK Government to even consult, let alone seek the consent of Scottish ministers before exercising the powers in this bill in devolved areas. Now, I know that the Minister has said those powers would not normally be used without seeking consent, and his predecessor did offer a number of non-legislative commitments to the Scottish Trade Minister Ivan McKee in March, and I'm genuinely pleased that the Minister, during the committee proceedings of the bill, committed to honouring those non-legislative commitments. He said, and this is in column 240 in Hansard on the 23rd of June, I restate the commitments made by my right honourable friend when he was Minister in his March letter to the Scottish Minister Ivan McKee, and that is genuinely very welcome. However, he went on to say, in opposing what was then Amendment 8 and similar Labour new clauses that dealt with the same issues, in short, and I'm quoting, "We're already delivering the engagement envisaged by proposed new clauses, and we've achieved that while continuing to observe the important constitutional principles enshrined in the devolution settlement." I disagree, Madam Deputy Speaker. Giving the UK Government the ability to directly affect devolved powers without the statutory requirement to even seek consent is not observing the devolved settlement. He went, I'll give way briefly, yes.
Thank you for giving way. And obviously the trading ability is something which concerns each and every one of us across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Can I ask the right honourable gentleman, would he be prepared to support new clause 4, which would give the authority to devolve assemblies in Scottish Parliament and further comes to the floor of this House for ratification? Surely supporting new clause 4 would be a step to make that happen as well.
I'm more than happy to support new clause 4, not least because I've signed it. But it's a slightly different thing. I think ensuring parliamentary scrutiny, and I'll come to say a little more about that later, is important, but it is different to seeking consent from those administrations whose policies or policy direction may be affected by a UK Government decision. However, the Minister went on to say, in terms of the new clause we debated in committee, very similar to this one, in fact identical, this proposed new clause would give the devolved administrations a statutory role in the reserved area of international trade negotiations, which would be constitutionally inappropriate. Well, he's partly right in that the amendment would give the devolved administrations a statutory role, but only insofar as the provisions of a trade deal affected devolved competencies. That is not constitutionally inappropriate. It's a matter of good administration and respect. However, his key argument against what was proposed, and I'm quoting, is that it was not practical. He said, and I quote, "It would lock us and the devolved administrations into prescribed ways of working under the existing Intergovernmental Memorandum of Understanding, a document last updated in 2013. Well, that may be an argument for revisiting the MOU. It might also be an argument to say the government should adhere to the terms of the MOU under any circumstances. But it's a very strange argument for opposing this amendment. Surely it's better to base negotiations on an agreed framework, better still an agreed statutory framework, rather than to leave them up to chance, make up the rules on the hoof, and give an impression of the UK Government acting in an arbitrary way. His key argument, however, was as follows. He said, as parts of these agreements touch on devolved matters, the legislation will create concurrent powers, and we've sought to put in place concurrent powers to provide greater flexibility in how transitional agreements are implemented. So far, so good. However, he said, this approach permits greater administrative efficiency, reducing the volume of legislation brought through the UK Parliament and through the devolved legislatures. It cannot be right that the UK Government intends to legislate or can legislate in the areas of devolved competence for the sake of administrative efficiency. There are far bigger and wider principles at stake than that. If I may now turn to new clause 7 in my name. We know that trade deals can put pressure on food standards and can lead to the importation of low-standard food. We know that the US administration, for example, has made clear it wants the UK to lower its food and animal welfare standards. This new clause 7, includes a ban on the importation of food which is produced to standards lower than that in the UK. We also know that the US and other countries have far lower animal welfare standards and adopt practices which are illegal in the UK for health and environmental reasons, including chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-fed beef, the use of various pesticides and GM crops. None of this is a great surprise to anyone in the House. And we believe that the quality of Scotland's food and drink produce, and indeed food and drink produced elsewhere in the UK, and their standards are essential to maintaining our established international reputation in those areas. So I'll give way briefly, yes.
I wonder whether the people in Scotland, as the people in England and in my constituency in Winchester, might not just be way ahead of the politicians. Because ultimately, won't the consumer decide? Just recently, we heard Waitrose make it very, very clear that they wouldn't be selling any product that was imported to a lower standard than we currently enjoy in this country. And their new boss actually quoted chlorine-washed chicken. I just wonder whether the public might be ahead of us on this one already.
I want to be very careful how I answer this, and I hope that the honourable gentleman understands. Perhaps those who can afford to shop in Waitrose. I know the Minister boasted about this during committee. He was a Waitrose fan. Perhaps they have a choice. Perhaps somebody who's counting every penny and doesn't have access to anything other than the cheapest of food is not in the same position to make the same choice. So this new clause effectively does two things. It affirms the UK's rights and obligations under the SPS agreement, that is the application of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures in Appendix 1A of the WTO agreement, and it prohibits the import of food into the UK if standards in the exporting country are lower than those in force in the UK. And I don't think there's anything contentious about that. And of course, it's not just campaign groups like the Trade Justice Movement who back this. It's not just Scottish Land and Estates and the NFU who back measures like this. The BMA have weighed into this debate and said this bill presents an opportunity for the UK to present itself as a global leader on standards on food imports for the benefit of human, animal and plant health and the environment. To fulfil this opportunity, it's vital that our current high standards are upheld and protected in any trade deals, and they suggest this new Clause 7 and new Clause 11 should be backed in order to achieve that. It's also necessary to have this on the face of the bill because the government's approach to protecting food standards is slightly confused. In committee, this is column 305 on the 25th of June, the Minister said this bill is about continuity. The imports under continuity agreements must continue to comply with our existing import standards, and I welcome that. But in column 306, he said, decisions on standards are a matter for the UK and will be made separately from any trade agreement. And there's the concern right there, that the UK could, if it wished, lower standards, opening the door to all sorts of horrors. So let's make sure, at least in the rollover arrangements, that is not possible by including the UK's obligations under the WTO. The sanitary and phytosanitary agreement are written onto the face of the bill. It's also important because although the purported objectives of this bill are about rollovers, the definition of trade agreements is very wide, and the long title does not restrict its use only to rollovers. And if I can turn finally to new Clause 8. This new clause would ensure that the UK Government has a duty to restrict market access to healthcare services, including medicines and medical devices. And we've tabled this amendment precisely because trade deals do have the potential to negatively impact on health services. Now, while the UK Government has repeatedly pledged that the NHS is not on the table in trade negotiations, we know that leaked documents have detailed conversations between UK and US negotiators revealing that health services have been discussed, including the US probing the UK's quotes, health insurance system, and the US has made it clear its desire for the UK to change its drug pricing mechanism. So this new clause includes specific carve-outs for the NHS all relevant services and regulation, meaning it would be illegal for the government to conclude a trade agreement which altered the way NHS services are provided, or liberalised further, or opened up to particular sorts of foreign investment. No use of negative listing, because such clauses require that all industries are liberalised in trade agreements unless there are specific carve-outs, and it isn't always easy to define what services count as health services. For example, digital services may seem irrelevant to health, but NHS data management, GP appointment systems are increasingly digitised. No standstill or ratchet clauses, because these provisions mean that after the trade deal has been signed, parties are not allowed to reduce the level of liberalisation beyond what it was at the point of signature. Now, there are many examples of how this could impact in the real world. I'll give one example only briefly. The Scottish Government had private cleaners in the NHS and quite a high degree of hospital-acquired infection. The private cleaners were replaced by NHS cleaners, and the level of hospital-acquired infection fell dramatically. Had a ratchet been in effect, let alone ISDS, it may not have been possible to do that, with detrimental mortality and morbidity consequences for real patients. Now, I mention ISDS. This clause also says there should be no investor-state dispute clauses, settlement clauses in trade agreements, which only allow private investors to challenge government policy when it affects their profits. And again, if I can refer to the BMA, who have also piled into this debate, they have said the bill must rule out investor protection and dispute resolution mechanisms, which undermine the supremacy of the UK courts, prevent the rollback of privatisation, and risk deterring, delaying or blocking health improvement measures. And we've seen examples around the world of where that has happened. It is fundamentally quite wrong for large corporations to use ISDS-type arrangements to be able to sue governments simply for taking steps to protect the well-being of their citizens, or for enacting public health measures which they believe to be right and for which they may well have an electoral mandate. And I'll give way one more time.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I think he's making a fine speech. Does he agree with me that it seems a considerable irony that those on the other side of the chamber who were so determined that this country should not be subject to any supranational court system should hereby, in an ISDS clause, enable our Parliament, our government, to be sued by foreign companies in specialist supranational courts in a way that isn't even accessible to our own domestic companies?
Yes, and I made that point. It's wrong to have these provisions available only to investors in the way has just been described. I mean, if we want a supranational body which adjudicates, arbitrates and works, let's have the UK government put some pressure on the friends in the United States and get the WTO appellate body back up and running and functioning again. That would be the best thing for trade around the entire world. The new clause also instructs there should be no changes to drug pricing mechanisms. This could also happen through IP and non-patent exclusivities. This would be bad news for patients, taxpayers, health boards and trusts around the country, and our view is that trade deals should not be used to facilitate this. Now, in opposing an amendment like this, or a new clause like this in the committee stage, the Minister said, and this starts in column 315 on the 25th of June, the NHS is not and never will be for sale to the private sector. Fine. He said, we've always protected our right to choose how we would deliver public services and trade agreements, and will continue to do so. His argument was fundamentally, and I'm quoting, however laudable the new clauses were, they were unnecessary. And he went on to explain that the UK already had rigorous checks and balances on the government's power to negotiate and ratify trade agreements via the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, CRAG. There are two big issues which jump out from this, given what the Minister said, and I have it in full if he wants to reread it. Firstly, there is absolutely no practical reasons at all why protections for the NHS demanded by the public should not be included on the face of the bill. And secondly, and more importantly, because the so-called rigorous checks and balances in Crag described amount to little more than a take-it-or-leave-it choice at the end of the negotiations. The need to protect the NHS from the outset in legislation is paramount. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 to the House, and I do hope, time permitting, we can press a vote on new clause 7 and Amendment 10.
We now have a time limit of 4 minutes. Teresa Villiers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support this bill because I believe that removing unnecessary barriers to trade can boost jobs and growth. But I do hope the Minister and the Government will consider seriously whether changes can be made to strengthen parliamentary oversight, whether it's via the amendments today or in the other place. I was one of 18 Conservative MPs to back new clause 2 of the Agriculture Bill. I did so because I believe our trade policy should be consistent with our values. And this government was elected on a manifesto with stronger commitments on the environment and animal welfare than any of its predecessors. But maintaining our domestic rules on animal welfare and environmental stewardship of land will have less and less of a real-world impact if more and more of our food is imported from countries with lower standards and fewer qualms about these matters than we do. So I would like to hear the Minister confirm this evening that this government will keep in place the import ban on chicken washed in disinfectant, and it will not at any stage ask this Parliament to remove it from the statute book. And I hope he'll say the same about the ban on beef from cattle whose growth has been artificially boosted by hormones, many of which in the United States we know are intensively reared on feedlots containing thousands of animals fed off soy production, contributing to deforestation in the Amazon basin. And the reality is more or less every country in the world reflects sensitivities over food in their approach to trade policy, for the good reason that food security is crucial to any society. And I warmly thank the Minister and the Trade Secretary for agreeing to establish a commission to consider how we can secure the economic advantages of free trade agreements without undermining our world-class food standards. And those standards would be undermined if we allow an unrestricted, tariff-free influx of food produced using methods which would be illegal in this country. A good deal with the United States, a mutually beneficial deal, could see tariffs coming down, even in sensitive sectors like beef, so long as incoming food complies with animal welfare and environmental standards which are equivalent to our own. And many US producers are perfectly capable of doing that, and it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to develop a certification and compliance system. Contrary to what some have claimed, this is not a rerun of the debates on the Corn Laws, and it's a caricature to suggest that those of us raising concerns have somehow been captured by producer interests, as our Victorian forebears in this House were. All I'm asking is that we don't sell ourselves short in this country. The UK is the third biggest market for groceries in the world. Even conditional access to that market is a valuable prize. Just because we would like a trade deal with the US doesn't mean that we should give them everything they want. There is so much we can offer our trading partners in the US and other countries, and is it so unreasonable to say that when it comes to food, there are limits to liberalisation? Thank you.
Flora Anderson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this trade bill is fatally flawed. This trade bill could have been a bold statement about our future trade deals, where we've used our independence from the EU, whatever we feel about it, to build in high environmental and food standards, workers and consumer rights, commitments to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, human rights. and to modernise our trade rules in conjunction with constructive, modern, democratic scrutiny. Instead, this bill is stripped of any of those. I urge members to vote for new Clause 4, which will enable the people's elected representatives here in this House and in the devolved authorities to say what's important for the British people. High standards should be written in to trade agreements from the start to the finish of negotiations and ensure that, for example, secret deals don't end up with selling off the NHS to the highest bidder. Chlorinated chicken could be just the start. These are not doomsayers or baseless concerns. More than 400 NHS and public health senior professionals have signed an open letter demanding legal guarantees in post-Brexit trade legislation to provide specific protections for the health service in any future trade negotiations, such as the US. And US trade deals are already underway in secret. But even in the US, both houses in Congress get a guaranteed vote on trade agreements. And America's process for public consultation prior to negotiation is impressively far-reaching, in contrast to this bill. The British public are being sold out by this bill. What is the government afraid of? What is the government planning to do? What desperate deals will be struck to get a deal done, but on worse terms? In my own constituency, 39% of jobs, Madam Deputy Speaker, are in sectors identified as being severely impacted by a no-deal Brexit or a bad deal with the EU. I'm extremely angry, as they are, that as an MP I will have very little say over preventing this. Food standards are a very huge concern to my constituents as well. They are deeply worried that decades of progress in animal welfare, hygiene, husbandry and environmental management are going to be stripped away. Farmers and consumers will be worse off. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am very disappointed that this bill went through several days of scrutiny in the Bill Committee, which I was a member of, without any changes whatsoever. And today we have just a few minutes, really, of parliamentary debate before this bill will go to the next stage. It started in the late afternoon of only one day. We heard evidence about how much stronger our trade negotiators could be if they had the backing of parliamentary red lines written into our legislation. But we were told over and over again by the Minister that proposals for parliamentary scrutiny, for food standards, for environmental standards and workers' rights were not necessary. Not necessary. I've only got a few seconds. If the planned negotiations will be including all of these rights and standards, then this should be guaranteed by being written into parliamentary legislation. But if the government is planning to agree a bargained-down, watered-down race to the bottom, then I can see why these amendments would be rejected by the government. And this is why we should all be very worried about our future and about this trade bill.
Robert Court. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great honour to speak in this debate, having spoken briefly in the second reading and having sat on the Bill Committee and being a member of the International Trade Select Committee as well. We had a very wide-ranging, very well-informed, very constructive debate during Bill Committee stage, and it's good to see so many of the members speaking here again today. There's a number of points I would like to address, but I won't be able to because of the time. I'd like to be able to speak to some of the NHS-related clauses that we've heard. I'd like to be able to speak to some of the scrutiny-related clauses as well, but I will confine myself, if I may, just to one point, which is that relating to standards, particularly that as we see from new Clause 11. Now, new Clause 11 can be simply put as one that will prevent the import or will only allow the import of agricultural goods only if the standards to which the goods produced were as high as the standards that applied under UK law. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the face of it, that sounds very reasonable, because on the face of it, that sounds something that just seeks to ensure what we already have, and nobody has any difficulty with that. Everybody here wants to maintain the high production standards, the animal welfare standards, and the environmental standards that we've had. And that's why the government has been absolutely clear that it will do precisely that. That's why the Minister stood on a manifesto commitment to do exactly that. That's why I stood on a manifesto commitment to do exactly that, as did everybody here. But there's a number of misunderstandings which I will briefly address. I'd like to turn first of all to the issue of chlorine-washed chicken or of hormone beef, which we hear a number of times. Heard it already from a number of times from the speeches opposite. We'll hear it again, I'm sure, before the end of the debate today. Those are already illegal in UK law. They're illegal because they were in European Union law. European Union law is put into UK law by the terms of the withdrawal agreement. And so when members opposite plaintively say, why won't the government just put this in primary legislation? It's because it's already there. And if it were to be removed, then the government would have to bring something to this House, and they would have to get us to vote on it, and they would have to change the law. And we've all expressed our view about that. So that prohibition is already there. So it's simply unnecessary. But what this amendment seeks to do is to go further than that. What this amendment seeks to do is to go further than maintaining our high import standards. And it's crucial that you distinguish between import standards, which is the safety of food that's brought into this country, and safety standards, which is the way that they are produced domestically. What this amendment seeks to have us do is to say to all of our trade partners, we want to go further than to ensure that we import safe food. What we want to do is to reach into your domestic legislation and to tell you exactly how you produce that food. And that is something, in a moment, and that is something that no self-respecting independent country is going to want to do. Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to them for giving way, but that is clearly patently false. All it does is say that if you want to produce food that is coming into our market, if you want to export it into our market, then it must be produced to those standards. It doesn't in any way seek to impose legislation in the United States or anywhere else that would govern the way in which they can produce food there.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I don't agree with him on the wording of the amendment. The amendment talks about standards which at the time of the import are applied under UK law, which means that the standards have to be applied the same in the foreign law. So that means it goes far further than what is intended by this bill. No country is going to allow us to have dynamic alignment is going to accept dynamic alignment imposed upon them by us any more than we would. We can't say to Mr Barnier, we don't want to accept dynamic alignment from you, but by the way, we want you to accept dynamic alignment from us, because you've got to have standards that mirror the standards that we have in our own domestic legislation. What these amendments are intended to do is simply to kill trade. Because nobody wanting to have a trade deal will accept these terms. It would make it impossible to have trade deals that allowed food to be imported from the poorest areas of the world, in particular in the developing world. It would obviously kill off any prospect of any trade deal with anybody else. It would kill off our existing trade deals that the Minister's trying very hard to roll over in the course of this bill, and it might even render it impossible to secure a trade deal with the European Union. These are therefore trade-killing amendments. They are wholly unnecessary, and I would urge the House to reject them.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is extremely interesting to follow the honourable member for Witney, who seems to be labouring under a completely false set of perceptions. First of all, the standards that is being referred to in New Clause 11, and indeed in many of these amendments, are the standards for those products that are being exported from country A to us here in country B. We are not making any comment about the products that are circulating within that country. We are simply saying that if we want our farmers, for example, not to use sow stalls, how does it make sense not to apply those kinds of conditions to the imports of food that is coming from countries that are using those standards? Because if our standards imply higher costs, that means that if we're not, therefore, having some way of moderating the goods coming in from countries that are not imposing those standards, our farmers are going to be undercut. So I really wish he would get his facts straight before standing up and saying that these amendments don't make sense, because they do. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am standing to speak to New Clause 9, which is tabled in my name. New Clause 9 stipulates that no international trade agreement may be ratified or implemented if it restricts the UK's ability to pursue its climate and environmental goals. It requires the government to make full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements by all participating nations the priority during trade negotiations, and also to prioritise facilitating action to that end at the World Trade Organization. Thirdly, it requires regular reporting on compliance with the above, and overall would ensure that the government's trade policy is in line with its international climate obligations and domestic environmental targets. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Trade Bill should have been an opportunity to provide a clear direction of travel on the UK's new trading status. It should have set out a democratic, environmentally and socially just framework for a new, pioneering and independent trade policy. The Conservative election manifesto promised that they would not, and I quote, compromise on our high environmental protection, animal welfare and food standards. Yet, as we have seen, the gap between reality and rhetoric is a yawning gulf. We do not want yet more warm words and nice rhetoric. What we want are some red lines in the negotiations, and the way to get them is to write them onto the face of this bill. And that is all that this side of the House is asking for. So instead, what we have with this trade bill is the same rehashed controversial proposal from before the general election, one that fails completely to take account of the long-standing climate and nature crises, or indeed the COVID-19 pandemic that has happened since. Now, the UK's objectives for trade deals must change to keep up. They must prioritise action to tackle the climate crisis, sustainable food supply chains, decent work, and, as has been so sharply highlighted, universal and affordable access to medical supplies. As it stands, this bill risks undermining the UK's social, labour, environmental and agricultural standards. It fails to ensure that imported products adhere to at least equivalent standards, and I therefore welcome all of those amendments that have the same kinds of objectives as my new Clause 9, which would provide us with a framework for protecting the standards which keep us safe. And this is not an academic discussion, as we know. We know the US administration has made very clear that it wants the UK to lower its food standards to allow the export of products currently banned in the UK. And that is why we need to be on our guard.
Listening to her carefully, as I always do, while we're dealing in facts, because she said that we, following the member for Whitney, we should deal in facts, which I thought he dealt in beautifully for the record. But does she accept the point that the Food Standards Agency, for which I used to be responsible as a minister, would have to propose a change in regulatory standards to make any change in lowering standards, let's say, for instance, in how one washes chicken? They would have to propose a regulatory change which have to be brought through this House, these Houses of Parliament. Does she accept that as a fact?
Happy to accept that as a fact, but is he willing to accept that the unwillingness of this government to put its absolute objectives on the face of this bill is causing massive concern, which is why thousands of people are writing to the Minister and saying that they are deeply, deeply concerned. So why not put it on the face of the bill? Unless it is there, we are not going to take it seriously. I'm sorry, I just don't think that people are going to believe warm words. They want it on the face of the bill. Now, we need to be listening to those people who are contacting the Minister. That includes, as we've heard before, not just the NFU, but many other organisations, many people from civil society. But we also need to be listening to the science. And I just want to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by talking to the issue of climate change and the fact that all of our policy arrangements going forward need to be aligned to the essential fact of meeting or not exceeding the threshold of 1.5 degrees. This year, 2020, is on course to be the warmest ever. Aligning trade policy with environmental and climate objectives is not just something that will be good to do. It would be reckless and perilous to do anything else. And yet, despite the hype of a brave new post-Brexit world, this trade bill perpetuates the status quo. It is totally unfit for purpose. From the point of view of standards, for the point of view of democratic scrutiny, for the point of view of secret courts that can also undermine the kinds of values that we want enshrined in trade bills going forward.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise in this debate, and can I thank and welcome the fact the Minister has sailed this bill to date through the committee stage unamended. I have to say, to follow the Honourable Lady from Brighton Pavilion, the rhetoric, facts, and a couple of other statements you made, certainly all mixed together, but I'm afraid that I do agree fundamentally with much of the colleague from Whitney. And the fact you want something on the face of the bill that is already the law of the land, I think, gives excellent credence to what rhetoric is. Certainly come back in.
One of the reasons I want it on the face of the bill is the way in which it might get changed otherwise is through statutory instruments that might not even see the sides of this chamber. We want it on the bill so we can have the debate here in this chamber.
The Honourable Lady, I know, understands the process of this House probably better than me, and for a SI to sail through this place without a vote on the floor would mean a dereliction of duty by the opposite benches. And I know as well as the Honourable Lady does that it would be very easy to facilitate a vote on that. Not just that, the Treasury bench has been absolutely clear. And what I do want in my short amount of time I have, Madam Deputy Speaker, is first of all to echo the Right Honourable Lady from Chipping Barnet. I agreed very much with her thoughtful contribution at the opening of this debate. Also to pay tribute to the chair of the EFRA committee, the honourable member for Tim Holton, who I think is the grandfather of the commission we now have for trade and agriculture. Not to age him, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the honourable member did more to engage me with my farmers than the NFU has done in a decade. And so I suspect that was done in 10 minutes amending the last bill rather than what the NFU tried to do in an ongoing dialogue.
Would you give the honourable member give way?
I would happily give way to the honourable lady.
I thank my honourable friend and constituency neighbour for giving way. He mentions the commission, and we were lobbied by many of our farmers who urged us to set up that commission. The government has listened. Does he agree with me that that's the evidence of this government listening to farmers and upholding our manifesto commitment?
I dare not agree with my parliamentary neighbour. And I will say, can I very much welcome the Commission, and to the Treasury bench can I say it is welcomed by my farmers, my agricultural community. The membership of that committee gives a certain amount of comfort to the farmers I daily engage with, representing one of the largest agricultural communities in this country. And we will look, but I do want to focus for a second on what my honourable friend from Whitney was saying around the whole subject of chlorinated chicken, because that product has become a lightning rod, a focus stone. And just to re-emphasise that there is an import ban in place, there is a law of the land in place that cannot be imported into this country. It would be an incredibly brave government Treasury branch and Chief Whip that ever brought that issue to this House in the guise of this government. And it seems to be members opposite over and over again trying to charge this whole debate emotionally with that product, despite the full knowledge that it is illegal to import into this country. And I think that shows shame on the opposition benches for trying to whip this issue in such a fashion. If I could focus for the brief... happily.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. The horse meat scandal revealed significant vulnerabilities in the traceability of our food supply chain. Would the honourable member not accept that just as pork and horse meat found their way into what was meant to be beef, without these additional protections written into the face of the bill to protect consumers from chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-fed beef, we risk a similar scandal in future?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've won the argument on chlorinated chicken and we've moved on to another product. But what I will say to the honourable lady is that's why working with the government, as I'm doing with the Secretary of State for both DEFRA and Trade, I'm working on the traceability, the accountability, the labelling, is the right thing to be doing, not making cheap political points in what is one of the most essential debates and bills for this country right now. What I will say, and what I was trying to get to, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the scrutiny in this place. As a member of the International Trade Select Committee, can I commend both our SNP chair, the illustrious chairman of the International Trade Committee, who has brought some real teeth and scrutiny to the process. The willingness of the Secretary of State and our negotiators to brief the committee in private session has been extremely welcome. The fact that we have the CRAG procedure, which has been talked at length, and again, I can see some members starting to smile on the opposition benches, but I will say it would be an opposition that really could not use the process to the full advantage, that couldn't bring a vote against any kind of trade deal that came forward. It would be an opposition completely derelict of their duties to think that anything could be snuck through, never mind the backbench of this government, which will hold our government to account and is our job. But I am safe in the knowledge, Madam Deputy Speaker, having spoken to the Minister at length and the Treasury at length on these issues, that the trade deals we are doing will be welcomed in my farming community, will be welcomed in my agricultural community, and will not just open up markets that they want, like lamb, to the United States of America, which is the second largest importer of that meat in the world, open up the beef already, which has been lying dormant for so many decades, but also enable the import of products that will be at a reasonable standard, and with those import bans in place, in law, that will not be removed, consumers in my constituency and across the United Kingdom can take huge comfort from that. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know there's a time limit and other members want to get in. Can I commend the Treasury Front Bench for their engagement with our farming community, with myself and the International Trade Committee, and commend the bill amended.
Ben Lake.
Follow my constituency neighbour, the Honourable Member for Montgomeryshire, and I shall begin on a point of consensus, for I fear that we might diverge a little bit as I proceed, but I'm sure the Honourable Member will agree with me that trade is an important part of the Welsh economy, worth £17.5 billion in 2019 alone. And while the government pursues trade deals across the world and to explore new opportunities, I think you'll also agree with me that it should not squander the opportunities that are on our doorstep. For although Wales is a proud global partner, we cannot escape from the fact that at present more than 60% of Welsh exports are destined for our friends and hopefully our continued close trading partners in the European Union. And so in that regard, I do hope that negotiations with the EU will conclude in such a manner that will not see the introduction of new barriers to this trade or indeed additional costs to our businesses. I am certain, however, that the UK's approach to trade with the other members of the global community must champion the interests of each of the UK nations, an objective that I believe is far more likely to be realised successfully if all four governments of the UK play a role in formulating trade mandates, scrutinising negotiations, as well as ratifying agreements. I commend the remarks of my right honourable friend from Dundee East, who eloquently detailed the bill's deficiencies in this regard. And it would only add that the government should guarantee the democratic rights of the devolved administrations are respected in this bill, as well as to offer legal protections to our public services and strengthen some of the safeguards when it comes to parliamentary scrutiny of standards. Unfortunately, as it stands, the bill, in my opinion, denies the role of the Welsh Parliament has in articulating Wales's interests. That's why Plaid Cymru's tabled amendment New Clause 18 to ensure that all four nations must consent to any trade deal struck in their name, and will be supporting New Clause 4 in addition to the amendments tabled by my right honourable friend from Dundee East that ensures not only that this deficiency is addressed but also that UK parliamentary oversight is strengthened. There has been much debate in recent months about the issue of standards, especially those of agricultural and food imports. I would welcome and would put on record that I welcome the establishment of the Agriculture and Trade Commission, but I am concerned perhaps that a 6-month remit will mean that such a valuable forum will not play a constant role in UK trade policy. And I would also perhaps appreciate if the Minister, in summing up, can address some concerns that have been conveyed to me about how precisely the work of the Commission will feed into some of the negotiations that are currently underway. With Welsh food and drinks exports worth over £530 million in 2018 alone, you can appreciate why international trade is such an important part of Wales's rural economy. And these concerns will feature quite heavily in some of my rural communities. Briefly, before I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would also add to the comments made by my right honourable friend from Dundee East about the need to reform the investor-state dispute mechanism. And this is particularly important as we deal with the global socio-economic consequences of COVID-19. I welcome moves recently by the European Commission, as well as some of the candidates for the Director Generalship of the World Trade Organization, in seeking to explore new multilateral investment courts to replace the ISDS system, and hope that the government can consider engaging constructively in these discussions. Therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just finish by saying that I hope the House will support New Clause 4, as well as the amendments tabled in the name of my right honourable friend from Dundee East, for I do think that they will improve trade policy for the UK in the future, and indeed the integrity and our democratic engagement in those negotiations.
Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd just say to the honourable gentleman, it's a pleasure to follow such a thoughtful contribution, and diolch yn fawr to all three Welsh MPs that have just spoken. 9 untied, I'd have me if I didn't do it properly. Right, I rise to give calls, my voice to calls for more trade and more opportunities for business in global Britain, especially those close to my heart in South Ribble and in wider Lancashire. This bill allows for more than 40 existing trade agreements with other countries to be kept in place for us to access a £1.3 trillion global procurement market, and for us to protect vital industries from product dumping by overseas actors. Finally, we clear up the rules on sharing data in customs environments, all vital to the health of our domestic and export businesses. This useful and practical bill is tidying up the details on laws currently with the EU and adding them to the UK's statute book. I also rise to put to rest the concerns I have heard from many of the good people of South Ribble who have been worried by some of the noise and misunderstandings around the bill.
On that point,
certainly. Give me to jump in.
Madam Deputy Speaker, through you, of course, does my honourable friend agree that members opposite wish to simply sow doubt amongst the public over the NHS? We've had 10 years in which to privatise it, and we haven't. The last time it was privatised was, in fact, in 2006, with Tony Blair's independent sector treatment centres. So, wouldn't you agree that there's a certain amount of hypocrisy from across the benches?
Catherine Fletcher.
Honourable friend is entirely correct. I mean, having been part of the Trade Bill Committee over the past weeks, I've had the opportunity to hear at length the arguments made for this bill and today's amendments, and I've listened hard to the details and drawn my own judgments. The advocacy for new amendments is strong. The proponents on the opposite benches articulate them well. They express fears which at first glance seem reasonable. However, these are fears and not realities, and I worry that members opposite are seeking to conflate what's actually in the bill with fears of what could be in the bill and wider conversations about trade. I know I'm relatively new to this House, but it doesn't really make sense to me. So what are the actualities of this piece? There is much noise about Parliament voting on future trade deals. We can, more so than other countries like Australia and New Zealand. The CRAG process allows us to vote on trade deals, and if we change our own law around trade, we will vote on them in this place too. In reference to the Amendment NC4, I must draw on my business background. As anyone who's negotiated any type of deal before knows, if you're at a table and you have to say, I agree, but I have to get 650 other people to agree, it rather ties your hands in the negotiation. Let's trust our elected government to act in the best interests of global Britain. And as my honourable friend mentioned, these backbenches to hold them to account. Should it be needed, there is still a backstop. If we as a Parliament need to block a trade deal after negotiation, we can. If it changes our laws, it will need a vote in this place, and FTAs cannot, by their nature, unilaterally change UK law. This is similar to Canada's system, and they're forging on with trade deals and doing all right. I've also had much correspondence from the people of South Ribble raising concerns about our farmers and their wonderful quality produce. People say you need to reassure constituents. There is concern that if a clear and explicit government commitment to uphold food standards isn't included in this trade bill, existing food law, including retain law, could easily be changed. If I was in their shoes listening to that, I would be worried too. Let me put their fears to rest. We will not remove the UK's current food standards. For example, hormones and chlorine in food are banned now and will remain banned. Full stop. These current standards are in EU law and will be rolled over when we leave the transition period. We've promised to keep import standards in place, and we will. And for those concerned about having a say, should they ever be changed, these will be voted on here in the UK Parliament. If we put food standards rules into this trade bill and ask those overseas to adhere to them, then we are asking for those abroad to abide by our law. This is something we wouldn't and don't accept from other countries, and our friends abroad will almost say, no thanks. We will put a restriction on trade which will hurt us. Let's not. Put it another way, putting food standards regulation into a bill, rolling EU law into UK law, is a bit like putting a frock on a frog. It will look more than a bit out of place down the negotiating pond, and people will be disappointed when they kiss it and it doesn't turn out to be a protectionist princess. There's a right place to protect the UK's food standards when products are imported, and we will, but not in this bill.
Yeah. Sarah Olney.
Deputy Speaker, it's always a pleasure to follow the member for South Ribble, as I recall I did when she made her maiden speech. I rise to speak in support of new clause 4, tabled by the Honourable Member for Huntingdon, who I know is scheduled to speak immediately after me and will doubtless give a detailed account of the reasons for his amendment. But in anticipation of that, I wish to set out why the Liberal Democrats are supporting it. From January the 1st, 2021, the UK will be setting out on its own for the first time in nearly 40 years in developing its own independent trade policy and negotiating its own trade agreements. The implications of this step on everyday life in the UK are huge and possibly not yet fully appreciated. Trade negotiations are complex and delicate. To secure access to international markets for one sector may mean conceding international access to our domestic markets for another. To secure preferential treatment on tariffs for some of our goods may mean relaxing import controls on something else. We have a complex economy, currently disrupted by the need to beat the coronavirus, and on the verge of major change as we transition away from carbon-emitting activity. Technological change offers both threat and opportunity. We must also consider that our economy is imperfect in its distribution of wealth and opportunity, and look for ways to address this challenge. And, increasingly, the UK is being called upon to stand up for the defence of fundamental human rights and liberal democracy and use the powers at its disposal to effect change internationally. Our trade policy and agreements touches on all of these urgent challenges. How can we best leverage our economic advantages to deliver current and future prosperity for UK citizens and influence peaceful progress abroad? It is an assault on our very idea of what a parliament is for to determine that these decisions are best made behind closed doors, without consultation or discussion. To balance all the competing pressures from different economic sectors and geographical regions, to fully consider the impact on different groups of workers, to determine whether we prioritise climate commitments over economic growth. How can this be done effectively without recourse to Parliament? The British people deserve to have their interests properly represented when these questions are being asked, and for the answers given by ministers to be put on the public record and judged accordingly. I also speak in support of new clause 9, tabled by the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion and supported by the Liberal Democrats, because we recognise the urgency of taking action against the very real threat of climate change. It is essential that we enshrine this urgency within our trade legislation, so that negotiating partners know, before the first papers are exchanged, that they must comply with our environmental goals. Our economy is transitioning away from carbon emissions in accordance with the democratic mandate to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, and that progress must be underpinned in every trade agreement we negotiate. Our commitment to net zero cannot be traded away in pursuit of other goals. The Liberal Democrats have also tabled amendments relating to dispute resolution and human rights. The issue of dispute resolution is fundamental to ensuring that the democratic decision-making relating to expenditure of our taxpayers' money or regulation on food standards cannot be undermined by lawsuits from foreign corporations. The UK Government should rule out at this stage any use of ISDS procedures from our UK trade deals to safeguard our ability to determine our own regulatory environment without threat of sanction from foreign investors. This is fundamental to ensuring that our NHS remains free at the point of use for all UK citizens, and that we can set our own standards in relation to animal welfare and food quality. I referred earlier to the UK's powers to effect change internationally and how we can use our trade agreements as leverage. We've been forcibly reminded of our need to use these powers to influence foreign partners to respect human rights, thanks to recent events in Hong Kong and China. It would send a powerful message to the Chinese regime and to others around the world that hope to trade with us if we enshrined in law our commitment to upholding human rights as a non-negotiable element of our trade deals. That message will only be compelling if we lead by example, and that example starts with parliamentary oversight of negotiating mandates and trade deals, and I implore colleagues to support new clause 4 this evening.
Jonathan Gianogli.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I speak to the amendments in my name and others concerning scrutiny of free trade agreements.
And simply put, the question that the House has to address today is whether post-Brexit the UK is going to have less scrutiny of free trade agreements, or FTAs, than we had before Brexit. This is the current government proposal, and I would suggest that it flies in the face of the claim that we leave the EU to take back control. The government has split FTAs into two categories. Firstly, and in the bill, all of the trade agreements that the EU signed with third countries before Brexit, which they wish to roll over to become agreements with the UK. And secondly, not in the bill, FTAs with any other country such as the US. New Clause 4 suggests a new scrutiny process for all FTAs. It will still be the executive that negotiates FTAs, but Parliament would get a yes-no vote on the negotiating objectives, and importantly, also on the final draft agreement, as happens in the US and Japan. Not only has this not ended up in the bill, but the government's position has seemingly reverted to having less scrutiny than we did as a member of the EU. For the last 40 years, the EU has been negotiating our trade deals, and as part of the EU scrutiny process, a yes-no vote would be taken by the EU Parliament on the draft FTA prior to signature. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend very much for giving way. And does he not welcome the commitment from our government on welfare, on environment and all the conditions in the trade bill? But does he not find it somewhat confusing why our government, our ministers, will actually accept new Clause 4? Because, scrutiny is fine because they are going to go along with exactly what they say they're going to do.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. In January 2018, when we had second reading of this bill the first time round, the then Secretary of State stood up and said that he would be looking for a process, an approval process, and taking soundings on a new process. That has simply not happened. So, as things stand, there is no longer a parliamentary veto and no formal scrutiny committee relationship yet established, despite US negotiations having started. The important point of a parliamentary veto, of course, is not that it is often used. Rather, as is seen in other parliaments, it encourages the executive to seek consensus on its negotiating mandate and keep legislators in touch during negotiations through regular discourse and discussion. A wise executive will naturally wish to avoid an unnecessary bust-up just before signing an FTA. Of course, this is where it all went wrong with the TTIP negotiations between the US and the EU. Here, both the US Congress and the EU Parliament were disclosing information to their respective elected representatives that was not being provided to UK parliamentarians. I give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. As he's mentioning very large trade deals, doesn't he mean that that's really where the crux of this oversight is required, on these very big trade deals, like with the US, like with China, or with the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, New Clause 4 does deal with all trade deals, but obviously the amount of scrutiny would be proportionate. As a result, and with the inevitable leaks, the whole debate surrounding thousands of lines of deal negotiations in TTIP got reduced to accusations of selling the NHS and Brits being forced to eat American chlorinated chicken. And I totally take the point of my honourable friend for Whitney that was a false accusation. One might have thought that the UK government had learnt its lesson from that TTIP experience. So this bill, I believe, needs to provide a statutory framework that encourages government to take early stage consultation and ongoing soundings through the course of FTA negotiations. This is in order that business, digital, farming, environmental and international development representatives and other citizens feel that they're being listened to with similar rights to their counterparts in the country with whom we are negotiating. But sadly, this is not currently the government position. The Minister constantly suggests that the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, the CRAG process, allowing a short delay mechanism before ratification, is adequate. This is the same CRAG process that was implemented by Labour in 2010 at a time when the UK had the EU parliamentary veto. And by the way, it's also the same process that was described in 2019, last year, by the Laws Constitution Committee as anachronistic and inadequate. Secondly, the Minister suggests that the Trade Select Committee could be utilised to provide scrutiny for proposed new FTAs, a plan I totally support. Let us assume here that the Trade Development Committee and the Trade Development Department, and therefore its committee, is going to survive a rumoured merger with the Foreign Office. Even so, and despite negotiations with the US and now Japan having already started, no such detailed arrangements with the International Trade Committee have yet been agreed. We know this from an on-the-record letter sent from the chair of the committee to the Secretary of State on the 18th of June. And if the position has changed, the Minister should take this opportunity to put that on the record. I'm not suggesting that MPs should be able to impede government negotiations on FTAs, and nor am I saying that MPs should be able to amend draft FTAs. However, proper scrutiny means that we need legislation that provides for Parliament to approve FTAs on a yes or no basis before they are signed, which is why, without having received any government offer to readdress this issue, I shall be asking that new Clause 4 is voted on this evening. Amendment 1 questions, and I have many amendments and not very much time, but I shall get in what I can, Madam Deputy Speaker. Amendment 1 questions whether the time has come, or actually came at the start of this year, to draw a line under the 20 potential rollover agreements not yet activated. The last rollover signed was with Kosovo just before Brexit, and since then it's become clear that most potential rollover countries wish to see what we do with the EU first, like Canada, for instance. Japan has offered a quick deal, but this will not be a rollover deal, as it appears that we're being offered something less than the EU's deal with Japan. But under this legislation, the Japan deal will still be treated as a rollover for scrutiny purposes. This somewhat undermines the government's main contention to date, that a light scrutiny regime for rollovers is appropriate, as the deal has already been scrutinised by the EU Parliament. And I don't just mean Japan. These Clause 2 powers may have been suitable before Brexit, when this bill was drafted in 2017, but I suggest that they should now be looked at again. Madam Deputy Speaker, I shall finish there.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak to new Clause 17 and new Clause 11, and on the principles of workers' rights, the National Health Service protection, and environmental and human rights. Firstly, in relation to workers' rights, we couldn't possibly imagine a trade deal with a country like Colombia when we know that the International Trade Union Congress rates it as the most dangerous place to be a trade unionist, which means that many members in this chamber who may be a member of a trade union could be at risk, could have their lives at risk, and yet to begin a trade deal with a country like that without even mentioning workers' rights seems to me to be absolutely ridiculous. The problem with this bill is how silent it is. It's silent on workers' rights, as I've said. It's silent on the real protection of the NHS. We have had some reassurance on the NHS, but in particular I'm worried about medicines and the cost of medicines, and also about our data. We know that the National Health Service, unified as it is, provides the most fantastic data for research and for pharmaceutical companies. And my fear is that if we don't have more protection in this bill, that it will be open to those companies, through whichever country they're based in, to have a kind of values-free trade negotiation, which we as MPs will not be able to scrutinise effectively, and which could end up using our data, because it is probably the best health data in the world because of the extent of it, the longevity of it, and the detail of it. I would seek reassurances from the Minister on that specific point. In relation to environmental concerns, of course, we're leaving the gold standard of environmental protections, leaving the European Union, but it would be so much easier to write that protection in and lead on that in this bill. Instead, it's almost values-free, this bill, around the importance of the environment, when after COVID, it's probably the biggest concern of our generation: climate change and dealing with the climate emergency. Furthermore, on the gold standard of food, and many members have mentioned this, but I would also say that not everybody can afford to shop at Waitrose, which is the supermarket which has said that it's going to have not buy low-quality goods. Many people, particularly following the economic crash which we are currently entering, which is the worst recession for 200 years, will not be able to afford not to buy the cheapest food. So we have to see this bill in that context. I give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Would she agree, though, that for many people, because they may go to a restaurant or to a fast food outlet, they would have no way of knowing the provenance of the food that they're consuming? It's not simply a matter of labelling in a supermarket.
Indeed.
And the honourable member makes such an important point, and one that I won't repeat.
But finally, just on the question of our role in this place, surely the last 4 years have taught us that people want us to be here to make those decisions, and yet tucking away a bit of legislation in the library for 21 days is not what we are here for, or running upstairs to an SI, we're in the middle of all party groups and all the rest. We need to have proper scrutiny in this place, and the Select Committee needs to have an enhanced role. Having sat on the Trade Select Committee and enjoyed it very much, I do feel that it should have a key role in ratifying the role of the Trade Remedies Authority Commissioner, and also, if that 6-month commission continues, in appointing the head of that commission. And I will be lobbying very hard with colleagues who represent very rural seats, unlike Hornsey and Wood Green, which is one of the most urban seats, to have a proper commissioner continue in that role. Why have it for 6 months? Let's have it forever. But let's have the Trade Committee ratifying those 2 appointments, and with the TRA, let's have a trade union voice and an industry voice. If there's one thing that we've learnt through COVID, it's how well the Trade Union Congress has worked, how well the CBI have worked together. They've led our government and told them what to do with COVID. Why can't they do that with the trade bill? We can get on, we can move forward together, but because we're saddled with this strong executive model, we must try and militate against that by having these other checks and balances in place, and this is how we can do it, by this bill tonight, by supporting the sensible clauses, which are cross-party, which share a lot of support across 2 benches. But let's try and enjoy that consensus building, because we are in a new chapter, but let's try not to spoil it by having a trade bill which is inferior, which is silent on the key issues which concern us of the day, be that human rights in China, be that environmental standards, which we've had a legacy of from our 40 years in the European Union, or be that on the important question of what are we doing here as MPs? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Paul Gerben.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the member for Hornsey and Wood Green. And in doing so, I just want to say that this bill is an opportunity for us to give a nimble approach towards doing business for the future for our country. And I say an opportunity. On listening to some people coming forward, I see it as probably a hindrance, because they're going to see every opportunity to actually frustrate and make it more difficult to actually drive the bill through. And in reporting back on every single deal that is being done, you end up, and I'm not an advocate of playing cards or doing anything like it, but definitely it is showing your full hand, and definitely that's not a wise thing to do. And I'm not saying that you should be playing poker, but we tell you, I've been in business and I know what it's like. You don't let your enemies know, or those that you're doing business know what you're doing on the other side, and you can work a deal every way. But many areas that we do have concerns about, and we've had a very strong lobby in relation to our agri-food and our agricultural industry, and especially those involved in the fishing industry. And I'll give way, yes, I'll give way.
Thank you for giving way, and obviously does the honourable member and good friend not agree that our fishing industry similarly needs this trade bill to show our strength of purpose and ability to stand outside the EU rules and regulations and stand upon the quality of the goods and services we are ready, willing and able to provide throughout the world? The fishing sector can grow if it's given the opportunity.
I have to agree with my colleague in relation to our fishing industry. We do have a fantastic product. I have ate in many countries around the world, and I must say I understand why they would want to buy Northern Ireland produce. It is the best in the world. Have an ate everywhere, I can tell you, unless you've had a soda farl from Northern Ireland, and I know we've some previous Secretary of States here who can bear this out, but it's vitally important, and we've had the agri-food end given us the lobby. Many within our farming sector lobbied us in relation to the agricultural bill which went through recently about changes they would like to have seen implemented and included in it. We're seeing this as a second opportunity to give protection, and I understand that those are telling us that we have protection already there within legislation. I don't always say that it's important to always, what way should I put it, gold plate things, but sometimes you have to reinforce the stance that you are taking, and that has to happen. And I think it's important that we do support and make sure that our farmers. Yes, I will give way, yes.
I
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Well, I agree with me that the devolved administrations play a key role in any future trade policy. Given Northern Ireland's dependency on agriculture, it's absolutely vital that this government listens to the devolved regions.
I think that is part of it. I'm a great unionist, and I believe that we are part of the United Kingdom, and we should be working together to ensure that we get the best bang for our buck. To use an American term, but make sure that we do as a United Kingdom, and that is vitally important. Unfortunately, as far as some of the things which you were talking about today, we have already protection in place, and I come from an engineering background. Electrical standards, we lead the world. We lead the world in electrical standards. Many other countries, yes, manufacture a lot more, but we lead in electrical safety. We set those safety standards. We make sure that goods which are coming into our country are made to those standards. Sony, and we're just looking, Sony make these monitors that we have up in front of us. They make specific monitors that are for sale in the UK, and only for the UK, because we have such stringent electrical standards. Now, they can, and they have the flexibility to do it. I know that there are farms within Europe, throughout the world, that will make food to actually bring into our market, but they will be bespoke just to suit our market. And as has already been said, that can and is being done. But I want to be sure that we give our farmers and our industry an opportunity to actually export onto the world stage, and to make sure that our product is sold. And to do that, we use this bill. Yes, I will give way.
Would you accept it? Actually export to 70 countries in the world, and they export to 70 countries in the world, many of whom have actually lower standards than the rest of the United Kingdom, but the goods are valued because of the standards of the product. And is that not, apart from the fact that we already know that there will be a requirement to change primary legislation, is that not yet another indication that there is no incentive for us to lower our standards, because we would lose those markets that we're exporting into?
I thank my member, and I agree with him totally. We do not want to lower our standards. We don't want to race to the bottom. We want to bring others up to the standard that we have set, and we have set the bar fairly high. But by setting the bar so high, we have additional costs, and it makes it more difficult for us to compete on a world stage. And that is vitally important that we do address that, and we get that put in place with whatever measures we have to put in place in subsidy for our farming, and to ensure that we have a product which is still viable and still economically possible for the housewife to buy. I've used the wrong term, I apologise, but those that are buying in their basket of fruit in the supermarket, they will definitely be able to get the best value for it. I support the bill, but I also support Amendment 4 and Amendment 7 in the bill that's been put forward, or new Clause 4 and new Clause 7 in the bill, in that I believe it does address some of the concerns that we as a nation and Northern Ireland in particular have. Thank you.
Who does Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to speak after the honourable gentleman for South Antrim, because the agriculture and fisheries in this country is very important, and it's very important in Northern Ireland, and the family farms and the family fishing is important as we do trade deals as we go forward. And I very much welcome the Secretary of State actually putting in place the Trade and Agriculture Commission, especially led by Tim Smith, who will, I believe, be a very independent chair of that commission. And I can assure this House that we will make sure that whatever its findings it comes forward with will be heard on the floor of this House. And we will make sure, too, that we will hold our ministers and governments to account on our future trade policy, because I actually believe the government is honourable in coming forward and putting into our manifesto, having a real commitment to both environment and animal welfare and to trading conditions as we move forward in our new trade policy. But I think what we must always do is actually reinforce that and make sure that it happens, because I know our Prime Minister is very keen on getting trade deals with the whole of the world, and I very much welcome that. I'm not part of the old Corn Laws farmers who want to make protection part of this new system of trade. But I think when we are negotiating, let's make sure that in that great moment of trying to bring about a trade deal, that perhaps agriculture, food, environment is not quite as up the list of importance as it should be as we deal with the City of London and all these other matters which are hugely important to this country, but so are our welfare standards and food production. Because it's not only about those welfare conditions and environmental conditions, it's also about cost of production. And if cost of production is lower in these other countries and animal welfare standards are lower, then it will actually put our farmers out of business. I mean, and Sonny Perdue, the US Secretary of State for Agriculture, he went on Radio 4 and said that animal welfare is protectionism and told us to let our farmers compete. Well, we know what he means by that. And I don't actually disagree with him. I disagree with his method of farming, and I disagree with what's going on in the United States with higher density of population in poultry, hormones in beef. But it's quite right for him to be able to argue that in America that's their standards, and so we lower our standards in order to compete. Now, I would say to Sonny Perdue, why don't you raise your standards in America and compete with us? But I don't suspect that is actually going to happen. So that's why we do have to go into these trade negotiations with our eyes open and make sure we trade and trade a good deal. Because trade agreements are very good for our economy, provided the trade agreement is right. Trade agreements just for the sake of a trade agreement, because we've ticked that particular box and we've ticked that particular country and we've got a great trade agreement, will only be thus if it is actually good for what we produce and for what they produce. And I can accept in America we can get more lamb, and that will be a very good thing. But you see, as we do trade deals with perhaps in the future countries like Brazil, what do Brazil do? They plough up the savannah, they grow soya, they grow cereals, they grow sugar, they push the cattle into the rainforest and knock that down in order to produce beef. So let's be absolutely clear as we move forward, and let's keep this Trade and Food Commission in place, because it will give the government the right information it needs and our trade negotiators to enter into those trade negotiations but deliver a deal that's right for all people and all industries in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The standards, protections and rights that we've all come to enjoy are now being put at risk with this bill. The rules which govern trade must strike at the heart of our values that we expect of ourselves and each other. And trade policy must therefore be transparent, subject to thorough parliamentary scrutiny, and must respect all the nations of the UK, and on that, this bill fails. Now more than ever, as this country builds back better, we must ensure that the health of people and the planet are protected, that standards, workers and welfare rights are raised, and our society becomes more resilient and sustainable. And there can be no rolling back on rights, no undercutting of protections, and no selling out of our values, no compromise on standards. But at a time when we face so many crises on three fronts, Madam Deputy Speaker, health, climate and the economy, all aspects of government policy must be aimed at mitigating and eradicating those crises. But despite the rhetoric, this government yet again fails. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, neither the environment nor climate are even mentioned in this bill. The world's poorest already bear the heaviest burden of climate breakdown. Trade policy must be rebalanced to put justice and fairness at the heart of future agreements. And there must be recognition from the government that their lax approach on the environment in trade policy will lead to the promotion of cheaper but drastically higher carbon and poorer quality imported goods. This is bad for business, bad for people and bad for jobs. With UK producers, creators and innovators being undercut, and a disaster for our environment. But first and foremost, the UK's future trade agreements must be compatible with our commitment to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees C by the end of this century. Trade policy must have embedded it at its legal core the Paris Climate Agreement and the UN
Sustainable Development Goals. Only then can we guarantee a base commitment over trade policy which will be legally binding and which will work progressively towards the kind of high recovery that we desperately need to see. And the trade bill is also detrimental to food standards, the future prosperity of the UK's agriculture sector and animal rights, welfare rights. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this week is the week of the Royal Welsh Show, the week where farmers and food experts come together in Llanelwedd to celebrate our great produce. Those farmers who have really helped put food on our tables during this recent crisis. But this trade bill does nothing to help them, only weakens them. And despite UK government promises to farmers and food producers that we would accept no watering down of standards, this government continues to pursue the prospect of agricultural market access to the United States, where we know the qualities fall well below that of the UK. A selling out of our farmers, appeasement over action, that's what we get with this government. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is window dressing scrutiny whilst government machinery continues to proceed down the same calamitous path. And far from handing power to Wales, this bill hollows out the right to regulate the standard of goods. And on that, I will finish there. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's always very unsettling speaking in here because my colleagues seem to leave me and the whips seem to come in. And I can reassure them that I am actually on their side this time. And I commend the bill in its entirety. I've listened very carefully to members across this House as they have raised their concerns over the standards of food and scrutinising the quality of our trade deals. But I do feel that we must take this bill alongside the Environment Bill and the Agriculture Bill and the Fisheries Bill when it comes through these places. Because the point is that the Agriculture Bill took the steps that many people in this House and in this debate have been calling for. Where we talk about welfare standards, the government has moved to a position of where it is performing a consultation on labelling, which I can assure you is something that doesn't go far enough for me yet, and I will be hot on their heels about making sure we have an extensive labelling system of our agricultural produce sold in the UK and that goes through restaurants and supermarkets. But I think it is also committed to doing a commission, and a commission that I agree with the member for Tiverton and Honiton should be extended beyond its 6-month remit. That is something that actually gives us the advantage to scrutinise and to uphold the standards of our food and of the welfare standards of our imports. That is something that is very important and I don't think can be expressed enough. It is what the NFU called for, it is what the NFU got. And so I think we should be very clear about it. That commitment is there, and that commitment came in the Agriculture Bill. So to keep going on and on and on that we are lowering our standards is a misnomer, it's a fallacy, because in the Agriculture Bill it is there, in black and white, exactly what the opposition want. But ladies and gentlemen, also members, if I may, the benefit...
Gentleman means Madam Deputy Speaker.
But I think one of the benefits that I've seen and in reading this bill and looking at the amendments is the point about recognising the export potential that is there. What we are trying is to take, in my own constituency, the benefits of Brixham fish or oceanographic technology that is manufactured in Totnes and be able to export it across the world, to be able to open up new markets for it. This bill allows that. And I'm afraid my colleagues from Northern Ireland pit me to the post on this by mentioning the fishing sector. But there is a huge opportunity in doing so. We can now open up new markets in the Far East. This bill allows us to do that, and we must support it in its entirety. I should also add that actually, in doing so, we can start allowing ourselves to be able to strengthen the union. We talked a lot, and I've listened to the members from Wales speak about how they want their produce, and members from Scotland talk about their produce, and Northern Ireland produce exported around the world. Well, I think it is time to revamp the Board of Trade, to strengthen and to listen to what is the best of each of those areas, and to be able to help export it to the international community. That not only will strengthen the union, which I'm sure will be agreed upon by all members of this House, but also allow us to be able to reach those markets. Yes, of course I will.
For giving way. Would he agree then that weakening devolution, taking back powers from the devolved administrations, means strengthening the union? Because I don't believe that.
This is exactly what the Board of Trade was reintroduced by the member for North Somerset, I think it was. When he reintroduced the Board of Trade, it was about enhancing and developing a conversation with the devolved administrations to make sure we were listening to what they had in their areas, to be able to take them forward to the international markets. It's no good to turn around and say that we are not listening and not working together, because that is exactly what we are doing. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill, I feel, covers a number of significant points in which we will be able to reopen, reinvestigate our export markets, to be able to reinvigorate those sectors that we hold dear in this country, and to be able to uphold the standards that are so important, and I commend it. Thank you.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This trade bill is deeply flawed. I've been contacted by countless constituents and campaigns, each of them highlighting a different failing of the bill. It seems everyone's opposed to it except the government. While the government may argue that this bill simply allows for continuity, the reality is that it sets a precedent for future trade legislation. Its main failing is the lack of parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals. That this bill is essentially designed to allow for a new trade framework after we leave the European Union makes it deeply ironic. When the people voted to take back control, I suspect they meant for the people and to Parliament, not government ministers and unelected advisers. To be honest, the idea that we should trust the power to approve trade deals to government ministers is laughable. Just last month, we debated the fact that the Secretary of State for Housing had overruled his own inspector in favour of his friend and party donor, despite admitting an apparent bias. On top of this, we have government contracts that are seemingly being handed out to businesses with links to ministers and advisers. Parliament has a right to scrutinise and debate every aspect of government, especially in matters that are as important as trade deals. The fact that members opposite don't appear to agree with this is deeply worrying, if not surprising. However, it's not just the lack of scrutiny that's the problem, it's also the lack of protections. It's no secret that the US government wants a trade deal where the NHS is on the table, along with our higher food standards. It's also no secret that there are those in government who would sell off our NHS as soon as they thought they could get away with it. These last few months, the NHS and its staff, along with other key workers, have been all that have stood between Britain and complete devastation. They've given their energy, their health, and even in some cases their lives. Rather than thanking them with applause and praise, let's start with a trade bill that ensures the NHS is off the table by enshrining it in law. Then there's the issue of food standards. My inbox is full of constituents worried that this government is so desperate for a US trade deal that they'll water down food standards, allowing for chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef to be sold on the shelves of British shops. No doubt the government will say that this is scaremongering, but I would ask them to explain to the farmers and voters in my constituency why they won't place food standard guarantees into this bill. And finally, this bill lacks any guarantee of workers' rights, human rights or environmental protections. They are vitally important to protect our planet and to improve living and working conditions across the world. They must be a condition of any trade deal and must be included in this bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, in order to approve this bill, the government are asking us to trust their judgment. Unfortunately for them, on this side of the House, we've actually seen where that judgment takes us. Based on my inbox, the public do not trust the government to negotiate these type of deals. If the government insists that the NHS is on the table on the trade deal, they say that any trade deal must meet existing British food standards and that they intend to uphold workers' rights and environment protections. If this is the case, then they should accept the opposition's amendments today and commit these pledges in law. If not, we have proof of what we already suspect, that they are ready to sell off to the highest bidder.
After the next speaker, the time limit on backbench speeches will be 3 minutes. That doesn't apply to Kate Osborne, who has 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Ahead of today's debate, like my honourable friend here, I also received hundreds of emails from constituents asking me to ensure that the NHS is kept off the table in any trade negotiations. And I share their concerns. We know that the United States and Donald Trump expect a trade deal very much on their own terms. And we also know that for the President of the United States, the interests of corporate America come first, and that he will demand that the NHS pays higher prices for US drugs in a fair trade deal with the UK. Although over 60% of my constituency of Jarrow did vote in favour of leaving the European Union in 2016, they did not expect it to lead to our NHS being controlled from outside the UK. Over the last few months, the NHS has coped tremendously throughout the peak of the coronavirus pandemic, even though it has not been properly funded for years, over 10 years, due to this government's unnecessary and unwelcome programme of austerity. The coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated how important healthcare being accessible to all is. However, as this trade bill currently stands, it gives no protection to our NHS. We already know that our NHS has already been turned into a market, making services vulnerable to being included in the deal unless they are clearly and comprehensively excluded. And I can see no evidence so far that this government wants to ring-fence the NHS and keep it out of trade discussions. The bill also gives no role for Parliament to review or oversee trade agreements and weakens parliamentary democracy. Although those on the other side argue that the UK has in fact taken back control of its trade policy, do they not find it ironic that there was in fact more parliamentary scrutiny and democratic oversight of trade policy when we were part of the European Union compared to what's being proposed now? We also need to ensure that both public health and social care data relating to UK citizens are protected. Research concluded by Global Justice Now states that the United States wants its companies to have unrestricted access to UK data, including NHS health records. The value of this health data is estimated at around £10 billion a year. The bill in its current form gives free rein on UK data being moved to servers in America. This could mean that the NHS would be unable to analyse its own health data without paying royalties and could find itself buying back at considerable expense diagnostic tools, medical technologies and expertise, even when these have been created from freely exported NHS data. And it isn't just the NHS that's at risk. The bill as it currently stands says nothing about climate change, human rights or workers' rights. We need to ensure that any bill passed protects the employment rights or terms and conditions of employment for public sector employees and those working in publicly funded health or care sectors. Failure to protect our NHS will be yet another broken promise from Boris Johnson, insulting us all and particularly the sacrifices that especially our wonderful NHS and care staff have made. And failing to protect our NHS means that instead of a pay rise and a stronger NHS, we'll get more US companies profiteering from our ill health. But it's not too late to put in place strong protections for our NHS, and I call on this government to commit to protecting our health service so that it cannot be subjected to yet more privatisation through trade deals. Thank you.
Members might wonder why I'm persistently calling people on the opposition side of the House and no one on the government side of the House. I will preempt a point of order by explaining that because of the rigid system we are currently operating, when someone pulls out of speaking, I have no flexibility to go on to the next person on that side of the House. Therefore, we will have another speaker from the opposition side of the House, Navendu Mishra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With Britain heading out of the EU on the 31st of December, it appears that government is determined that everything must go in its post-Christmas sale, from food standards to our environmental commitments. This should be an opportunity to improve and strengthen existing trade deals and use them to provide an even better return for this country. Instead, we're faced with the prospect of everything being on the table and sold to the highest bidder, as President Trump stated on his visit to the UK last year. And as we know from the leaked documents that the Labour Party was able to obtain last year, the US is seeking full market access to even the jewel in Britain's crown, the National Health Service. And that's just what we know from the papers that weren't heavily redacted. Food standards should be sacred. We don't want chlorinated washed chicken in a can, or for that matter, meat treated with growth hormones, pork from animals that have been injected with drugs to make it leaner. And we should also reject the long list of foods being produced in the United States by dangerous and cruel methods, regardless of whether higher taxes are applied to them. Because even those tariffs will be scrapped within just 10 years, and as has already been stated by the International Trade Secretary, further enabling the US to secure comprehensive access to our food markets, whilst at the same time achieving the ultimate goal of, and I quote, reducing or eliminating tariffs. More than 1 million members of the public have signed a petition to protect food standards, but to date, it appears that the government has taken little notice. It is little wonder, therefore, that the government is now facing a rebellion by its own backbenchers. Madam Deputy Speaker, there must be proper scrutiny of this process, and Parliament should have a veto on any trade deal, and both this place and the other place should have a say over whether to approve any new deal that is agreed with any other country. And why should we leave ourselves at the mercy of the word of this government, who cannot be trusted to deliver anything, without legislative guarantees and beholden to US food trade associations who have enormous lobbying power and one goal in mind: profit? It shouldn't be left to big business to challenge laws and regulations simply because they inhibit foreign investment. In the same way as human rights, the issue of climate change should be central to our future considerations about trade policy. But worryingly, there is no mention of it in the trade bill, and the record for different countries when it comes to environmental protections is not suggested as a consideration in terms of negotiating future trade agreements with them. New trade agreements must be compatible with our commitment to stop global warming, passing the point of no return, so that we cannot simply trade our commitments on climate change away with pursuit of trade deals. Indeed, it should be quite the opposite. Trade agreements should be used to improve environmental standards abroad and ensure that climate justice and fairness are at the heart of future trade deals. This government must think again before selling its standards for a quick buck.
Well, as 3 government backbenchers in a row have failed to appear in the chamber, we'll go straight to Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is vital that as we shape our future trade policy, we do it in a way that maximises the benefits of our newfound independence, but does not sacrifice key industries within the UK. In the context of an economy facing the greatest challenges in my lifetime due to COVID-19, we are certainly not in a place we can sacrifice any industry, let alone the backbone of our economy, our agriculture industry. It is not too long ago that in this House the Agriculture Bill was debated, and in my contribution to that debate I made clear the importance of protecting British farming and the high standards it upholds in any future trade agreement. The opportunity to enshrine all that is good about our agriculture industry was not taken at that time. That was deeply regrettable and caused much concern amongst my constituents. So in this bill, Mr Speaker, we have another opportunity, an opportunity to make clear to those farmers and agri-food businesses that have been an essential component of the national effort against coronavirus that they will not be sacrificed in any future trade agreements. Indeed, we ought to be exploring how we can help the industry thrive in coming years to share in the benefits of life outside the EU. To do so, the fundamental building block is standards. In the context of our agriculture industry, future trade policy must respect the high production standards in terms of animal welfare and environmental measures that our farmers adhere to. We know this comes at considerable cost to the local farmers, and that overseas farmers have significant cost of production advantages due to lower regulatory requirements. In simple terms, if we flood the UK market with substandard products, it will see the demise of the industry.
To this end, the establishment of a Trade and Agriculture Standards Commissioner is very welcome, and I want to put on record my thanks to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland for ensuring the voice of Northern Ireland is heard in that by appointing Mr Victor Chestnut, the incoming President of the Ulster Farmers Union. On top of this forum, however, we also need to ensure Parliament has a strong voice and a meaningful say in the shape of future trade agreements. That say should be around mandating, negotiating principles and approval of any such deals. Our role should be proactive and not passive. That is why we will be supporting Amendment NC4. Parliament's role must be enhanced ahead of negotiations. It should be for Parliament to also scope out the critical negotiation objectives, and the interests of all parts of the UK are actively being considered and prioritised. Therefore, the devolved administration should also have a meaningful role. We also recognise that the important provision within the amendment for sustainability impact assessments, such as environmental effect, impact on animal welfare and health concerns. This ensures compliance with current food safety standards and to fully understand...
The Honourable Lady has exceeded her time by quite a long way.
Member for
Anthony Higginbottom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Upper Bann. Having spoken in the second reading on this bill and sat on the Public Bill Committee, it is a pleasure to speak today. Whilst I intend to cover mainly New Clause 4, I do think it's worth the House remembering that this bill is a continuity bill. This bill is intended to give confidence and continuity to the hundreds of thousands of businesses across the country who export to countries from Switzerland and South Korea to Chile and many, many more, that they can continue to do so. And I also want to agree with everything my honourable friend, the member for Witney, said, that actually many of the amendments that have been tabled to this bill, particularly those on standards, are actually intended to be anti-trade amendments that will do nothing to support our exporters and everything to kill off trade. In relation to New Clause 4, I think it's important that we remember, and all of our constituents are aware, that members of Parliament already have and will continue to have the ability to scrutinise international treaties that this government negotiates. The Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, as we have already heard, gives all members of Parliament those powers. So under the law as it already stands, if we are not happy with the contents of an international treaty, it will not be ratified. I also cannot subscribe to the view that Parliament needs to be more involved in negotiations, because I, like all of my constituents in Burnley and Padiham, watched the scenes from this place not that long ago when Parliament tried to be involved in negotiations, and instead of helping negotiations, it hindered it. This place was paralysed and the country was paralysed. Votes held on options were not helpful at all. I don't want to see that situation again, and in December my constituents voted to end that kind of paralysis and embrace the new opportunities that are available to us. As members of the European Union, no MP in this place was involved in trade agreements, but since January, the Secretary of State for International Trade and all of her ministerial team have made sure that we are. Consultations on the parameters of free trade agreements, objectives published in advance, and members of this House engaged, not just through parliamentary questions, but direct engagement. I've been able to speak to ministers about the objectives we have, the benefits they will bring to my constituents, and where my concerns are, and I have every intention of continuing to do so. So I will be supporting this bill and voting against the amendments, because we need to embrace the opportunities and move with speed if we are going to embrace the new world.
David Brock.
Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking to SNP Amendment 10 and New Clause 7, in particular in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Dundee East. I cannot quite work out whether the government's not noticed the potential problems with the quality of imported foods, or if it just doesn't care. And having listened to this debate, frankly, I think it's the latter. There are so many platitudes, but when the chance to do something concrete came up during the Agriculture Bill, ministers turned it down. Yes, pressures from farmers after that led to a commission to advise on a food imports framework of sorts. The honourable member for Montgomeryshire, no longer in his place, said its membership provided comfort to his farmers. That commission, though, has amongst its members Shankar Singham, a former lobbyist and favourite of various government ministers, who is on record arguing that we should accept chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-injected beef and genetically modified crops from the US. Mr Singham is not the only representative of the Institute for Economic Affairs on the Commission either. Lockwood Smith is also part of the IEA. Now that's important because the IEA is in favour of a hard Brexit and lowering food standards and environmental standards to satisfy countries such as the US, China and India in trade deals. We know that because it published a paper on it in 2018 and got censured by the Charity Commission for its trouble. Then there's the chair of the Commission, Tim Smith, a former Tesco employee, who said that concerns about food standards were alarmist shortly after he was appointed. I was actually alerted to that by the Department for International Trade. Astonishingly, its Twitter account was used to publicise a link to the article. So there are some who don't think the Commission is there to provide safeguards for our food standards. They worry it's there to draw a veil of decency over the indecency of the government's position. We were told during the Agriculture Bill that the proper place for provisions on the quality of imported food would be the Trade Bill, and here we are at the Trade Bill, and the government is intent on throwing those safeguards out of the window rather than enshrining them in legislation. Those are actions in bad faith, and they shouldn't be allowed to stand. During the committee proceedings, the Minister said that Food Standards Scotland and the English Food Standards Agency would ensure that food imports comply with our standards. How? How will they do that? Will they have teams inspecting the production chains in other countries as the EU does? How will the animal husbandry and production standards of other nations be monitored to prevent unsuitable food entering on our plates? Now the White Paper on an internal UK market is showing that the government has no intention of letting Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland do anything to protect their people. Lower standards introduced by England's government will have to be swallowed by the rest of us under these plans, and I frankly do not fancy swallowing anything they offer. Professor Michael Keating of the Centre on Constitutional Change makes clear in his response to the White Paper he considers it a power grab from the devolved administrations for the purposes of negotiating low-standard international trade deals. The Minister for Trade underlined that when he said that devolved administrations in trade deals would be constitutionally inappropriate. I agree.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And to start, I declare an interest in that my wife's family are farmers. Now, I've listened carefully to this debate and studied all of the amendments on the order paper before us. And I feel that there has been, amongst the amendments, significant mission creep. And as my honourable friend, the member for Burnley, said a few moments ago, it seems to have forgotten what this bill is actually about. And this bill is about those all-important continuity trade agreements that are vital for British farmers, for British exporting businesses, and for the United Kingdom as a whole. This bill is categorically not about new free trade deals, important as those are, and I'm delighted to see colleagues from the Department for International Trade busy negotiating them. And when it comes to scrutiny, I very much welcome everything that my right honourable friend, the member for Chelsea and Fulham, said in his opening statement, the lengths that the government has gone to ensure that differences in any continuity agreements are laid before Parliament, and likewise that where trade deals are likely to be different, where the government has an ambition to get a better deal, such as with Japan, that greater lengths are taken. Now, on farming, Madam Deputy Speaker, on agriculture, on our food standards, I cannot put it better than my honourable friend, the member for Witney, when he pointed out to this House that as we leave the European Union, those all-important standards, those food standards, will be transferred from EU law into British law. And the only way that that law could be changed is by this House. And so it is a false argument to suggest that there needs to be an amendment to this bill to fundamentally change what this bill is actually about in order to secure those standards that the Prime Minister has committed to, the manifesto I stood on and all members on this side of the House stood on, and likewise that my honourable friend for the member for Chelsea and Fulham has repeated on many occasions, and indeed my right honourable friend, the member for Bournemouth West, when he did so much to get this bill back before the House of Commons. And I would also argue that when I heard the opposition spokesman, who is now not in his place, talk about this earlier, I felt that he said he had a very one-sided view of the argument, in that it was all about protectionism, it was all about the domestic market. And of course the domestic market is important to all of our farmers. But the opportunities out there of international trade, the lifting of the ban on British beef into America worth £66 million, through trade, our farming can be assured prosperous for the future.
Liz Twist. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have a sense of déjà vu today, because it's just under 18 months ago that we had a debate in this chamber. There were a lot less of us in there then on future trade agreements, and we discussed these very issues that we're talking today. And it seems that the government hasn't listened substantially to the concerns that were raised then. In the time I've got, I just want to talk briefly about a number of them, because these are the things that hundreds of my constituents have written to me about over the last few days. And they're things that they've written to me about time and time again. Firstly, the NHS and the need to ensure that it's protected from being open to international competition. And that's why I'll be supporting new clause 17 today. It's essential that our NHS remains our NHS and we're able to protect that from competition. We already have some competition. We need to make sure that it's not open to the highest bidder. And people actually want that written into the trade bill to ensure that that can't happen. And the same point goes really for environmental and food safety standards. We've talked a lot about chlorine chicken, and we've heard something about environment, but there are a whole range of issues. Animal welfare issues are at the heart of this, not just chlorine-washed chickens or more detail. But people are concerned also about the impact of trade deals on the environment, and this is actually a lost opportunity. We could be using this bill to be creative and to ensure that we safeguard our environment. For example, an issue that I've raised in other places sometimes, the issue of deforestation, and ensuring that we can protect the forests through our trade deals. And the member for Winchester said earlier, he's not in his place now, aren't the public ahead of us on this? And indeed the public are ahead of us on consumer protection, and they are saying to us this needs to be written into the bill. Finally then, during the course of the last debate, we've talked a bit about labour standards, and I'm particularly concerned that the government should be protecting in this bill the trade and the agreements we have with less developed countries, and ensuring that fair trade and other trading agreements for those countries are safeguarded. It's an important part of their development. And finally, scrutiny. There's a great deal being said. I certainly will be supporting new clause 4. There is huge concern, and people should not underestimate this, that deals will be signed off behind closed doors. And frankly, statutory instruments, and we've all been in loads of those committees in recent days, are not the answer. We need proper debate and scrutiny. And these are the concerns that members have raised. This is a missed opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am excited by the possibilities for our future as an independent trading nation, and I support this bill and our listening government in taking us forward. This bill is about necessary data gathering for future improvements, for cheerleading, safeguarding and the effective communication of helpful information, but it is not about protectionism or featherbedding. The balance is to enable British exports that can compete against the world marketplace for goods and services to do so on a level playing field. I believe this bill helps to get the balance right. For example, it is quite right that the government intend to join the government procurement agreement as an independent party on substantially the same terms as we had under EU membership. The GPA provides UK businesses with access to public procurement opportunities worth some 1.3 trillion per year, opportunities that they are willing and able to compete fairly for. And of course, GPA partner access to UK public contracts will ensure taxpayers and consumers get the best value for money on major contracts, which in turn maintains the imperative for UK firms to stay innovative and competitive. An important part of the balance is to ensure opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, not just the mega companies. The UK rightly pursues an active SME participation procurement policy, and as an independent party in the GPA, we will have the opportunity to engage others on sustainable procurement, social value and workforce considerations. Madam Deputy Speaker, when exporters do everything right, when they produce great goods and services at the right price and in accordance with all the relevant rules, the last thing they want to face is competition that has circumvented the rules and that is artificially supported. So another part of getting the balance right is to ensure that remedies are available when needed. So I welcome the Trade Remedies Authority, which will have important work to do in continuing continuity of remedial action, not the least for Stoke-on-Trent ceramics. I applaud the Department's determination to secure an ever-increasing number of continuity agreements. It is important for business confidence that we make as seamless a transition into becoming an independent trading nation as possible, while signposting that the door is open to better trade agreements with various partners in the year to come. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill provides both continuity for agreements and remedies inherited from our membership of the EU and for the future independent free trading policy that we wish to strike in the future. This bill protects our national standards for our workforce, animal welfare, the environment, our NHS and our SMEs. It is a solid first step into the world for global Britain. I will be pleased to support it tonight.
Ruth Cadbury. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I spoke in an earlier debate on global Britain, I was accused of supping the cup of pessimism when I spoke about Britain's future outside the European Union. Yet members from both sides of this House, what we want is what's best for our country, for our economy, for our environment and for the safety and well-being of everyone living and working here. And many of my constituents have written to me about these concerns, but they also expect me here as their elected representative to be in the Parliament that should have a say, full accountability, not merely to receive a report once a deal is done. And as the Lord's EU Committee have warned, mere accountability after the fact does not make for meaningful parliamentary scrutiny. There's parliamentary scrutiny in the US, Germany, Australia and New Zealand, and we're going to have less control than we had as members of the EU. Now, oversight is not merely a lofty concept, but it has real-world implications. Others have mentioned threats to the NHS, food safety, environmental standards and so on, and I share those concerns. But I'm going to give another example, car safety standards. A major reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the US has tripled the number of road deaths per million compared to the UK is because, as EU members, our cars are safer than those sold in the US. Our cars have front and side impact, T-bone protection that gives protection for car occupants. And we also have requirements for much safer car fronts. Remember bull bars? We're not allowed to have them anymore. Still prevalent in the US, killing and maiming children, pedestrians, cyclists and so on. And new cars sold in the EU will have collision avoidance systems to further protect pedestrians and cyclists. So this trade bill risks imports from cars from outside the EU, presenting serious risks to the safety of UK road users. So I would like to know whether the Minister can guarantee that no vehicle will be imported into the UK after these trade deals are done, unless it meets recently agreed EU vehicle safety standards. And I'm going to finish on investor-state dispute settlements, which have been used by corporations to get rid of things like plain packaging on cigarettes, to scrap bans on fracking and overturn bans on certain medications, and stop compensation payments after oil spills. Madam Deputy Speaker, without transparency, those with the deepest pockets win, and we lose our consumer, our environmental and our social rights, and our planet is further threatened. So finally, will the Minister confirm that there will be no ISDS clauses in any trade deal signed by the UK? Thank you.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This trade bill represents a unique opportunity for us. And it is an opportunity in really challenging circumstances. As the global pandemic and the related economic impact and the significant challenge that we face as a country, as an economy, really you can't put it in place, in context, other than to say it is the most challenging circumstances that we have faced in the last 3/4 of a century. But we will come out of this, and we will come out of this stronger. We're entering a period of what is, and we can't deny this, unprecedented economic disruption. Not just here, but around the world. Now, we came together to protect our NHS, to save lives, but now we must expand. We must expand our reach, protect jobs, protect livelihoods, protect our economy. We must look, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must look beyond our borders. Now, I back British businesses. I know that in the UK we have a reputation for high-skilled, high-tech jobs, and we can put us in the global fast lane. We can be the most productive nation on earth. We can be the most innovative nation on earth. These deals that we are looking at, these deals that will be enabled by this bill, will be great for us. They will be great for Great Britain. Now, there are fantastic opportunities ahead of us. Fantastic opportunities in new markets, in fast-growing markets around the world. Not just in markets that we've currently explored, but in things like the Comprehensive Progressive Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we can look at markets that are growing more quickly, more explosively, doing fantastic things with data, robotics, technology, things that we can't do now, things that we can leverage our exit from the European Union to really propel the UK onto the global stage. So this is our call to arms. This is our opportunity to seize the chances of being an independent, sovereign nation. I think we can go global with this deal. I think we can stand by our businesses, back our local businesses, to really make an impact on the global scale.
Abina Apongasari.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today will be a historic day, one which we can hopefully look back and say, as Parliament, we did the right thing. Today we have the opportunity to vote to protect our food standards and farming industries, to prioritise the environment and animal welfare, to stand up for workers' rights and to safeguard our NHS from future trade agreements. Perhaps the government thinks that the public are not interested in trade negotiations, or that they're willing to just take the government's word that the NHS will be protected and workers' rights will not be undermined in the future. I can confirm the public are indeed interested and will not be willing to accept any lowering of standards in future trade agreements. A huge number of my Erith and Thamesmead constituents have contacted me in the last few days to voice their concerns over the trade bill. The main concern raised by constituents is the lack of oversight Parliament will have in future trade agreements if this bill is to pass in its current form today. One constituent asked me, why should our nation be faced with this democratic deficit? I thank the Right Honourable Member for Hunstanton for bringing forward new Clause 4, which will ensure proper parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals. I'm pleased that this member has recognised the flaws in the party's bill and has recognised the importance of parliamentary scrutiny as we leave the EU and forge new deals with different countries. However, there are other areas of the trade bill in its current form that are not fit for purpose and must be amended to offer security for workers in my constituency, to address the concerns of businesses that will be impacted and to give the wider public confidence that this government is serious about tackling climate change. With the government currently in talks with US over future trade negotiations, my constituents are rightly concerned that UK food and animal welfare standards are at risk. The government has said that our current standards will not be undermined by future negotiations. If that is the case, then I urge members in this House to legislate to protect standards by voting in favour of New Clause 11. This amendment will ensure that agricultural goods imported under free trade agreement in the UK must meet the standards applicable under UK law. This would include meeting the UK standards in relation to animal health and welfare, protection of environmental food safety, hygiene and traceability and plant health. This amendment will give the public confidence that agriculture products must meet hygiene and welfare standards. It will ensure that British agriculture industry is not undermined by low-quality international imports. This government has said the NHS is not for sale and that the public should not be worried about the security of our NHS and future trade deals. Unfortunately, the government's word is not enough for my constituents. I ask members to think about today and say that they did all they could to protect high standards and public health service that we treasure.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I had the privilege to sit on the Trade Bill Committee for this historic bill, and I have scrutinised this bill line by line. And I do believe that the new clauses 5 and 6 do strengthen this bill, as they do create the right balance by allowing trades to be conducted efficiently, as well as by providing my constituents in Stafford with the protections that they deserve. And trade is not an abstract concept. It affects all of our daily lives. International supply chains are important for so many of the products that we use every day, which is why it is so crucial that we get this bill right. From the Perkins engines made in Staffordshire to the generators produced by General Electric at their sites in Stafford, these factories are a vital link in international supply chains and provide jobs in my constituency that are so reliant on trade. And we must also not forget JCB, whose site in Hixon helps to produce the instantly recognisable yellow tractors that are found in so many sites all over the world, not just contributing to the British economy, but also helping to promote British businesses and our expert engineering overseas. And not only does this trade bill and new clauses 5 and 6 provide a framework for us to have more prosperous, long-term trading opportunities, it also gives us short-term certainty, which is something I believe we are all looking for in these unprecedented times. And I know that the Secretary of State for International Trade recognises how important trade is for the farming sector, and I'm grateful that she was kind enough to visit with me in Stafford earlier this year to take part in a roundtable with my local farmers. And it is vital that now Britain has the opportunity to create its own trade policy, that we strike the balance between encouraging imports of goods that we need, as well as incentivising manufacturing and production on home soil to sell both in Britain and export across the globe. Britain has some of the highest food standards in the world, and this is something we should be very proud of, both from a farming and an animal welfare perspective. And many of my constituents contacted me to say they are extremely concerned that this bill allows potentially food standards to be lowered, and I do recognise why some members in this House will support new clause 4. But having been on the Trade Bill Committee, I was able to raise this matter directly with the Honourable Member for Chelsea and Fulham, and I was grateful for the Minister for Trade Policy's personal assurances that there will be no compromise on our standards on food safety, animal welfare and the environment. And this, combined with the new Trade and Agriculture Mission with the Secretary of State and DEFRA set up to support the NFU, reassures me that the Government is upholding its manifesto commitments in relation to food standards.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I know that I've got a very short time, so I just want to make one point, and very quickly, and that is that I'm disappointed that the Government could not find any place on the face of this bill to give a written assurance that Northern Ireland will be able to participate fully in the international trade deals which we will strike across the world when we leave the EU, because it cannot give the assurance that the Northern Ireland Protocol will not, first of all, stop us benefiting from goods which will come into the United Kingdom as a result of trade deals, or indeed make the process of selling abroad so expensive that it puts us to a disadvantage when it comes to selling in other parts of the world. We believe we have an economy which is competitive, but it is not competitive when we are tied through the Northern Ireland Protocol to the single market, to the European customs territory, and therefore treat it differently than the rest of the United Kingdom. And the assurances which the Minister gives verbally, unfortunately, cannot override the compelling and the legal commitments in the withdrawal agreement.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with the leave of the House, I'd like to respond to what's been a wide-ranging and often well-informed debate. This bill is mainly about continuity, but it's also about sending a clear message, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are welcome traders. We are Network Britain, not Fortress Britain. I remind the House on standards that none of the 20 continuity agreements that Parliament has ratified has eroded standards in any way. Not one domestic standard in relation to animal welfare, the environment, human rights or labour standards has been eroded by any of the agreements. Let me try and deal quickly with 4 of the myths propagated by the opposition. First, on ISDS and protection for investment. This is something that is in the UK's interest. The UK has never lost a case in any of these tribunals. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, for 40 years, UK companies with jobs at stake have brought these cases. 80 of the cases, around 1,000 overall, have been brought by UK companies and UK investors, directly with UK jobs at stake. That is why this can be very important for UK business and for jobs of our constituents, to make sure that businesses operating abroad are protected. The second myth was in relation to devolution. We have been clear that we would not normally legislate in devolved areas without the consent of devolved authorities and never without consulting them. I think the mention from the member for the Dundee East was referred to a convenience. If it's more convenient for the UK to legislate for all 4 nations, then that is a sensible thing. In terms of standards, we've seen new Clause 11, Madam Deputy Speaker, and new Clause 7, even more extreme. These are seeking, and I'll read it out, to make sure that no goods enter the UK unless they've been produced at high or higher than standards which at the time of import applied under UK law. That could have massive unforeseen consequences. They think they're talking about chlorine chicken and hormone beef, but are they actually able to look people in the eye and say that cocoa from the Ivory Coast has been produced to at least as high environmental standards as it has been in the UK? Are they able to say that beans from Egypt have been produced to at least as high labour standards? Are they able to say that tea from Sri Lanka comes with the same high labour standards? I think they're putting a lot of this country's existing trade at risk. The fourth key myth, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the NHS. The NHS remains protected and will never be on the table at any trade deal, and that includes the prices we pay for drugs. We've had excellent speeches from my colleagues, the members for Tiverton, Hoddesdon, Totnes, Burnley, Buckingham, Stoke Central, Middlesex North, Stafford, Chipping, Barnet, Witney, Montgomery, South Ribble and Huntingdon. I thank them indeed for their contribution and for the opposition opposite. This bill is very important in securing the continuity of up to 40 EU trade agreements, the establishment of a Trade Remedies Authority to protect UK businesses and jobs from unfair trade practice, and access to the £1.3 billion global market in government procurement. We should accept, Madam Deputy Speaker, new Clause 5 and related amendments to allow better sharing of data. We should reject the other amendments which are either unnecessary, like new Clause 4, or in cases like new Clause 7 and new Clause 11, potentially deeply damaging for this country's economy. Thank you.
The question is that new Clause 5 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move Government New Clause 6 formally.
Formally.
The question is that Government New Clause 6 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call Jonathan Denogley to move new Clause 4 formally. The question is that new clause 4 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Clear the lobby, but before anyone goes anywhere, can I ask all honourable members, other than front benchers and tellers, to leave the chamber by the doors behind me? Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 263. The noes to the left, 326.
Liam. The ayes to the right, 263. The noes to the left, 326. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. I now call Bill Esterson to move new clause 11 formally.
Formally.
The question is that new clause 11 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. And people should go that way unless they're front benchers or tellers. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 251. The noes to the left, 337.
The ayes were 251 and the noes were 337. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. I now call Bill Esterson to move new clause 17 formally. The question is that new clause 17 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 251. The noes to the left, 340.
The ayes were 251 and the noes were 340. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. I call Stuart Hosey to move Amendment 10 formally.
Formally.
The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Aye. Division, clear the lobby. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 244. The noes to the left, 345.
The ayes were 244, the noes were 345, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. I call the Minister to move Government Amendments 6 to 9 formally.
Formally.
The question is that Government Amendments 6 to 9 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Consideration completed. Order. I must now put the question on third reading in accordance with the order of the 20th of May. The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
No.
Division.
No.
Clear the lobby. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 335. The noes to the left, 243.
The ayes were 335. The noes were 243. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. We now come to motion number 2 relating to proxy voting. Whip to move?
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motions 3, 4, 5 and 6. Bill Wiggin to move them together.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Disagree.